Morning, everybody. I'm Mark Mazur, the Robert C. Posen Director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you all here today. We have a fascinating event today titled, Should the Tax System Be Used to Reduce Inequality in the United States? And this is a little bit of a change for us. Typically, a Tax Policy Center event will feature economists, attorneys, and policymakers who discuss important policy relevant topics. One thing we're doing today is really broadening the set of participants, bringing in other types of social scientists who can help look at the overall social desirability of a wealth tax and what the implications might be. And the hope is that this will give us insight into the public debate on a wealth tax and the support or opposition to this policy. In addition to the in-person audience here, I'd like to welcome our online audience. For those viewing the webcast, you can submit questions or comments via email to the address events@urban.org. And I encourage viewers and attendees to participate via social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, as it says up on the screen. Now, I mentioned questions. We're going to have time for audience questions for each segment of today's program. So I'd ask you to think a little bit about what questions you'd like to ask, and please craft them in a form of an insightful question. Now let me introduce the keynote speaker for today's program. Jason Furman is a longtime contributor to and observer of public policy. Justin worked at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Clinton administration, at the National Economic Council, also in the Clinton White House, and then he was Deputy Director of National Economic Council under President Obama, and then served nearly 4 years as the chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Jason's now a professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We're incredibly happy to have Jason Furman here today to kick today's event off with an overview of the whys and hows of wealth taxation. So please join me in welcoming Jason Furman to the stage.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction. And he left out the part where we had offices just down the hall from each other at the Clinton Council of Economic Advisors, and also left out the part about how embarrassingly little I knew about taxes when he had this stack of tax notes that went floor to ceiling. Well, about 80 stacks of tax notes that went floor to ceiling. I spend most of my time now teaching, and when I teach an introductory economics course, I try to be pretty balanced and give both sides of the argument. And I think doing this for the last year has greatly confused me. And I keep planning to have an incredibly strong opinion on the wealth tax and exactly what should be done. It could be that it's a terrible idea or it's a great idea. Either one of those would be a great opinion to have. But I keep not having that, and wanted to walk through with you part of why I haven't wrapped my own head around it, because there's so many different reasons that are motivating a wealth tax, and so many of those different reasons move you in different directions when it comes to different ways of taxing capital income. Wanted to start, though, with the one thing I'm not confused about, which is that there's a tremendous amount of wealth inequality in the United States. There's a lot of debate among economists. There's lots of different numbers out there. There's lots of questions like, do you use estate tax returns? If you use an income tax return and somebody reports their interest, how much did they have in their fixed income assets and all of that? And you can get different numbers, but all the numbers are quite high. These are the OECD. It's looking across countries. And you can see at the far right there is the United States. We have somewhat high income share for the top 10% compared to other countries, but we have an incredibly high wealth share for the top 10% compared to other countries. So something is different here in the United States. Something is, in some ways, quite extreme in terms of wealth in the United States. The question, though, is what policies that motivates within taxation as a whole, and then within the subset of taxation that's focused on capital taxation. When it comes to the wealth tax itself, its proponents have made 4 types of arguments for it, which I'll characterize as power to the people. I don't say that as well as some might. Enjoy watching billionaires cry. These are very analytic concepts. They won't miss the money. And then finally, the sort of thing that's done day in and day out here at TPC, the really boring improve the tax code. So let's go through them. The idea of power to the people, there's a few different ingredients to go from this idea to a wealth tax. The first idea is if you have more wealth, you have more power. And there's lots and lots of evidence. Look at how often you meet with a congressman, how often you meet with a regulator, how often you vote, how much you donate to politics, how often you get your way in the political system. One question, though, that's quite important for a wealth tax is, does this derive from the distance between you and somebody else? Or is it that when the candidate has a fundraiser, they're going to have 7 seats at the head table, the 7 richest people in town are going to get those 7 seats, and if you cut everyone's wealth in half, it'll still be the same 7 people at the table, they just will have paid less for it. That's an important question to try to understand if a wealth tax will actually help this problem. If Jeff Bezos had half as much money, would that have made a difference? I can certainly tell you in our White House, we had, I think, a pretty open door, maybe too open a door, to Mark Zuckerberg and, when he was alive, Steve Jobs. I don't think anyone was saying they're going to listen more to Mark Zuckerberg because he has twice as many billions of dollars as Steve Jobs. Second question, and this has been a big debate that Saez and Zuckman have had on one side and Larry Summers has had on the other side, which is, what would a wealth tax do to the amount you donate to political advocacy in other issues? The issue there is just the classic, here we're teaching introductory economics again. There's a wealth effect. If you have less money, you have less to spend on everything, including buying elections or buying issues. But also relative prices change. Picture yourself in a world of a wealth tax. You want to reduce the taxes on yourself. You can spend more, but by the way, you can't spend more on houses, yachts, or artwork because those are subject to the wealth tax. You can spend more on fancy restaurants, but there's sort of a limit probably to how much you can spend on fancy restaurants. What can you do? You can give money to political candidates. You can give money to advocacy organizations. You can give money to ideas. And so if what you're worried about is that Tom Steyer or the Koch brothers has too much influence on our politics, giving them less wealth will give them less money. Lowering the relative price of donating relative to everything else they're doing means they'll want to give more money. And having some empirical evidence on which one of those two is larger and on what horizon would seem to me quite important before you just decide that a taxation on wealth will reduce the power of the wealthy. It might, if it led them to give more, magnify it. Would love to see, instead of some assertions, some actual research. And my own best guess is that the wealth tax would have a minimal impact on political power for these 2 reasons. And I'm not sure whether it would increase or reduce it for the wealthy, but I'm open to any of those conclusions and think we need to go beyond just the lots and lots of evidence that the rich have more political influence. A second type of consideration is, I called it evidence on billionaire tiers. You could call it positional externalities. When some people have billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, what does that do to others? Maybe you enjoy watching lifestyles of the rich and famous, and you're made better off by the fact that there's somebody out there who's living this crazy life, and you get to read about it and learn about it. Maybe people measure themselves in relative terms and measure their well-being in relative terms, and you're actually made worse off by the fact that there's somebody out there who is better off than you, and that if you reduced inequality, I'm sorry, you reduce them, even if you didn't raise that person, you would raise social welfare. That's to some degree a deep philosophical question. To some degree, it's also an empirical question. Part of me thinks that people can be quite jealous of people within their own group if they're a bit better than them or paid a bit more or get something unfair that they didn't get. The person down the hall has a nicer office than they do, but that these people don't matter in the same way. But again, to some degree, it's an empirical question about how people feel. To some degree, it's an ethical one of, is reducing the top of value in and of itself? If you have the political view or you have the externality view, then you're in a conversation that's a bit different than the traditional wonky, nerdy tax conversations. This is a quote from Saez and Zuckman, which is that higher tax rates' root justification is not about collecting revenue. It is about regulating inequality and the market economy. It's also about safeguarding democracy against oligarchy. That is, to some degree, a statement of values, but to some degree, as I said, it's a statement that understanding political science better, understanding social psychology better, and the like would help us understand it. If you think that, then you should tax above the revenue maximizing rate, because it's worth actually losing some money that you're no longer raising in taxes to achieve these other goals. You don't want to do nerdy little comparisons of the burdens of alternative tax systems insofar as they fall on the very rich. And by the way, if a tax system is really inefficient and it ends up with billionaires giving lots of money to accountants, we'd rather they give the money to the IRS, but at least giving it to accountants is making them less rich also. So we don't worry about that nearly as much as we would have otherwise. In other words, if your motivation is political or or externality, you're in a conversation that's different than minimizing the deadweight loss on taxes. We'll now go to the other two motivations. These are much more traditional tax policy considerations. One is just the traditional who would benefit more from an additional $100, Jeff Bezos or this woman. And I think there's a very, very long line of utilitarian reasoning. There's a lot of empirical evidence in terms of happiness and the incremental value of money being much higher at lower income scales and the like. And this just says tax from the top, give to the middle or the bottom. But it does say you want to tax in the most efficient way as possible. You want to get money from Jeff Bezos, but you care about how you get it. You want to get it in the way that causes the sort of least pain and suffering so you can get as much as possible for the woman in this picture. The final idea, which I think is pretty intriguing and I think has a certain amount of merit as a motivation for something within capital taxation, is motivated by this picture, which you won't be tested on, which is from a great paper by Lily Batchelder and David Kamen. And what they do is they go through similar types of income that are labeled differently. Do you label it as wages? Do you label it as profits? Does it show up on your W-2, et cetera? And show that it can be taxed anywhere between 0 and 41%. This means the tax system is not neutral towards different types of income. It means in particular that arbitrarily relabeling some types of income as capital income instead of labor income means you get taxed at very different rates on similar activities and similar types of income. And this says there's something broken in our capital tax system that could actually be improved. We could have a more neutral set of rates that were more similar across different types of activities. And then, of course, you could debate the level of that. But in some sense, I don't know if Doug Holtz-Eakin is here yet or not, but sort of Doug Holtz-Eakin and someone from the further left than him, and there's a few of them, maybe even in this room, would agree on the system and then just disagree on what the rate was, and that system would tax some things that were labeled capital income just to get that neutrality across different rates. These four considerations, the political and externality type ones, and the more traditional tax policy that you're willing to have a little bit of deadweight loss in order to have the utilitarian transfer, or that you are, or that you can actually make the tax system more efficient, lead to a couple different types of reforms. One is incremental, things like ending step-up basis, more consistent taxation of pass-through income, changed capital tax rates. Another is mark-to-market, where you have to pay your capital gains taxes every year, or when you sell the asset, you have to pay taxes as if you had paid them every year that you held it. A wealth tax, for example, 2% above 50 million, or some further deeper form of integrating the business tax and the individual tax, of which one of the leading proposals is Eric Toder from here. The types of considerations I gave, depending on what weight you put on them, would help you sort through these. In terms of a wealth tax versus a capital tax, just wanted to do one really important economic concept there, which is that a wealth tax is a high rate on the normal return. The normal return is what you need to make an investment, to put equipment or capital in place. And it's a lower and even zero tax rate on the supernormal return, which is all the extra return you get above and beyond that, so-called rents, monopoly profits, returns to entrepreneurship, and the like. Capital gains taxes, both of them, in similar ways. And just to give you an example, if you invested in treasuries at 2% a year, and you had a 2% wealth tax, then every year you're paying the equivalent of a 100% tax on your income. The capital gains tax, assuming it was ordinary rates, you'd be paying 40% tax on your income. Now let's look at somebody else. A successful entrepreneur gets a 50% rate of return. And by the way, a lot of billionaires along the way had a lot of years with returns way higher than 50%. Wealth tax for that person is only a 1% income tax. It's a really low tax rate on them. And the capital gains tax is actually a much higher tax rate on them of 40%. And just to illustrate that, the graph on the left is what happens if your net worth grows at 2% a year. The graph on the right is what happens if your net worth grows in roughly the trajectory that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg's did over the 12 years. He went from nothing to a lot. This is with the existing tax code. With a wealth tax, you'd basically flatten out the wealth of the person on the left. The person on the right, you wouldn't even make that much of a dent in it because it's such a low income tax rate on their return. That may be a good thing because you're not getting in the way of their entrepreneurship. It may be a bad thing because the whole point is that person has such incredibly high income, you wanted to tax their income at a decent rate. But I think a certain amount of wealth versus capital gains has missed how different they are. In contrast, if you did just a 23.8 capital gains rate on a mark-to-market basis, it wouldn't mean anything to the person on the left because they don't have any capital gains. To the person on the right, that would actually be a really huge tax. It would tax them much more heavily than the wealth tax would. And if you went all the way up to 40% on a mark-to-market basis, on the right, the wealth tax would have cost them $15 billion. This would have cost them about $56 billion. Now, some of the arguments for the wealth tax is that mark-to-market is actually too high a tax on that person, and that it's a good thing. You're taxing them more lightly through a wealth tax. You can obviously do both of these. At first, some people were choosing between one and the other. Now some have done both. But this has both an equity issue, but also an efficiency issue of which part of the return are you trying to tax, what type of people are you trying to tax on what types of income. I'd worry about the administrative differences between the options. When it comes to mark-to-market, an important question I'd have is the effort of getting there worth it? It's a lot more complicated administratively. I think absent administrative costs, it strictly dominates the current system. But in a world of low interest rates, in present value, how much extra revenue are you getting from mark-to-market relative to capital taxation? So more of a horse race between those two, sort of how much better is mark-to-market? Big question is how do these taxes affect people who don't get them? we certainly would like to, all else equal, if you're in rationale 3 and 4, minimize the excess burden on the super rich. Beyond that, does this result in less capital accumulation? Does it hurt other people? Does it lower wages? I'm skeptical about that. I think there's relatively little evidence for that, but I think that's also an interesting, important question. And finally, a legal question, just is there a constitutional option for wealth tax or a good way to design a fallback? Not something I have anything to add to the discussion of. So I'll end with what I would do today. I would do a constitutional amendment to allow wealth taxes and then take our time and decide on the merits whether or not we wanted to actually do it. I would do, if I had to pass a law today, all of these types of constructive realization of death, raising the rate on capital gains and dividends, a higher estate tax rate, rationalizing self-employment taxes and pass-through taxes, eliminating carried interest, all of that. These proposals have been around for a while. I think we're quite sure that they'll work. I don't think I'm very worried about unintended consequences. And they add up to a reasonably ambitious agenda. And then if we had 2 years to study the question before legislating, I think now is a great time, and I know TPC has started, on studying questions like mark-to-market taxation, something like annually for tradable assets and retrospectively for non-tradable assets, as in the Wyden proposal. And I don't know that I would want to legislate that today. The gains might be large enough that I think it's worth a serious amount of study to figure out, when we're in a position to do new legislation, whether we'd want to do something like that. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Jason. Just a reminder, the slides that will be that you're seeing today will be available on the website, on the TPC website at,
But if you
at the
told me
events
that,
page.
I would have never. No.
I just saw people taking pictures, and I wasn't sure if they were taking pictures of you or the slides. And I guess I was thinking the slides. So what I'd like to, what I'd like to ask is, what questions do you all have for Jason? Yeah, in the back here. We'll run a microphone over to you.
Thanks. Bill Arnell, National Academy of Social Insurance. Jason, you did address the issue of which of these approaches are more susceptible to tax evasion. I think Senator Warren assumes about a 15% evasion rate. I think Larry Summers said it's at least twice that. Any reflections on the tax evasion issue?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that was in that sort of encompassed in that administrative bullet that I spent 4 seconds on. So my fault, not yours. I don't know the answer to that. I think that is one of the questions you want to think about, and you want to design a system that has as little of it as possible. That is an argument that some degree of duplication and overlap, while in theory it may be a bad idea, in practice you may actually want to do something like that. I also do think any system's imperfect. So to point, if you had been around before the income tax was created, you could have pointed out to 8 different categories of income that we were never going to figure out how to collect taxes on. I don't think that would have been a compelling argument against the income tax. So I think this does affect the revenue estimates, possibly even by a order of magnitude of 2. Mm-hmm. It's an important consideration in designing it, but I don't think it's sort of the definitive argument for or against any of these ideas.
See, how about Dr. Toder up in the front? Yeah.
Hi, Eric Toder, Tax Policy Center. Jason, I was very intrigued by your first slide, which showed fairly modest. I was very intrigued by your first slide, which showed a fairly modest degree of inequality if you measure it by the share going to the top percent in the U.S. relative to the rest of the OECD. If you do that based on income, yep, and a very high share if you do it based on wealth, which implies a very high wealth to income ratio in the U.S. at the top of the distribution. Do you have an explanation of why that's true?
I find that intriguing too, and would love to look into it more. I'm sure somebody knows the answer to that. And in some ways, it might even be worse than it looks, because in the United States, you need more wealth because our Social Security, health, education, et cetera, systems are less generous. So if you're in the bottom 50%, 80%, you want to accumulate some wealth in America in a way that you don't elsewhere because you have public wealth in those countries. And if you adjusted for that, it would be a bit more extreme. I don't know if it's our tax system I don't know if it's the types of.
Less wealth at the bottom rather than more wealth at the top.
Oh, I'm saying if you counted Social Security as wealth here and you counted Social Security as wealth in France, the wealth of the bottom half would go up in both places, but it would go up even more in France than it went up here. So the differences between us and France would grow even larger than what's shown. So that compounded the mystery. So I don't know if it's in our tax system, our financial system, and the like.
Okay. Over here in the middle section.
Yeah, getting back to your discussion about the millionaires at the politicians' table, if you included a progressive personal expenditure tax in the mix with perhaps a pretty stiff rate, you might be able to address that. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe political and advocacy contributions would be taxed under that tax.
Right. So I'm not a lawyer. I would think you could have a tax that applied equally to a range of expenditures. I would think you could not have a tax on expenditures that were something related to speech that didn't apply to things that weren't related to speech. That would be my own guess. So I don't think you could target that. Could you have an overall progressive tax on expenditures? Yes, but then if you take that tax on expenditures and add a wealth tax to it, you are still lowering relative to the system without a wealth tax, giving people an incentive to give more money away more quickly. Even if they have to pay a higher tax on that, they're going to have to pay a higher tax on that today or tomorrow. In one case, they pay that tax today. In the other case, they pay that tax tomorrow, plus they pay the wealth tax in the interim. So no matter how you square it, any system with a wealth tax is going to have more incentive to give to all sorts of things. And maybe they're great things.
Let's see. Over here, right next to the person you just gave it to.
So going back to the wealth inequality graph at the beginning, I note that you're measuring it by the share of wealth going to the top 10%. But when we're talking about wealth taxes, it's typically, assets over, say, Warren's is 50 million. That's not 10%. That's less than 1%, probably around 0.1%. So do you know what that graph looks like if you're looking at the very top end of inequality?
Yeah. I couldn't find any, I agree with you, I'd rather show that. I couldn't find anything comparative across countries. Certainly if you look at the time series, it's high and it's risen. There's then a big debate as to just how much it's risen based on how you do things like capitalize interest income into asset values.
One last question. Anybody way in the back? Way on the far corner here.
Hi, you mentioned when you were talking about the relative marginal utilities of income, the desirability of, if we're going to tax the wealthy, we want to do it in as efficient a manner as possible in order to prevent forestalling investment, et cetera. And you talked about how the wealth tax actually puts a very high tax on the normal return and a very low tax on supernormal returns. So would a tax, say at the business level, targeting rents be much preferable and more efficient than a wealth tax?
Yeah, there's a proposal I'm really excited about that the Hamilton Project will be releasing on January 28th, and I'm really excited about it because after spending months procrastinating, I finally actually wrote it down and gave it to them. So they actually are publishing it, and I actually am going to be doing the panel with Mark Mazur, but it's a proposal very much along those lines, and I think there are ways, and there are low-hanging fruit in the tax system where you can get increased efficiency and growth and raise revenue in a progressive manner by better taxing rents. I think those rents are larger today. There's a lot of evidence they are because of things like monopoly power. So taxing them is, at worst, sort of free. You're just taxing some extra money that somebody got. At best, it's actually efficient because it's curbing an activity that is socially unproductive and socially harmful. So I think there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit in the tax system. I think there's not enough of that low-hanging fruit that you're not going to have to go into distortionary taxes as well, but I think you can start by taxing rents and get a lot out of it.
I have to end the question and answer session here just so we can maybe even try to keep a little bit on time. So join me in thanking Jason Furman for a really good discussion.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kimberly Adams. I'm a host and correspondent at the public radio program Marketplace. Very happy to see all of you, and thanks to the Tax Policy Center for the kind invitation to be here. We have our wonderful panel here with us, and we're starting with Kilolo Kizakazi, who is an Institute Fellow here at the Urban Institute, Jonathan Rothwell, who's a senior economist at Gallup, and Benjamin Page, who is the Gordon Scott Fulcher Professor of Decision Making at Stanford. Each of our guests is going... Northwestern, excuse me. Apologies. So sorry. Each of our guests is going to have a 3-minute introduction, and they are going to have some slides for us on occasion. And then we're going to have, hopefully, a very vigorous discussion about some of the issues that have been brought up here already and what they raise. And if you have questions, we will have a question and answer session at the end. And if you are watching online, you can submit your questions online to events@urban.org. So, Kilolo.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. Okay, while average wealth has grown over the last 50 years, it has not grown equally for all groups. Between 1963 and 2016, families at the bottom of the wealth distribution went from having zero wealth to being $1,000 in debt. Families in the middle of the wealth distribution doubled their wealth, and families at the top, the 90th percentile, had a 5-fold increase in their wealth. And as a result, in 2016, families in the 10th percentile of the wealth distribution were in debt, while families in the middle had $97,000 of wealth, and families at the 90th percentile had $1.2 million. One of the reasons for the rise in wealth disparity is the increase in income disparity. Some families some wealth comes from income that families are able to save and invest. Between 1963 and 2016, income for families near the top of the income distribution increased about 90%. And by comparison, families near the bottom had only a 10% gain in their income. The gap in the wealth exists not only between families in upper and lower income brackets, but there's also a racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is the disparity in net worth between families of color and white families. The median wealth of white families in 2016 was 10 times the wealth of black families and about 8 times the wealth of Latino families, and this wealth gap grew over time. This gap in the dollar amount of wealth also grows with age. White families accumulate more wealth over their lifetime than African American families, and white household heads in their 30s have a median wealth of about $87,000 more than African Americans. And by the time they're in their 70s, white household heads have a median wealth that's about 271,000 times more than older African Americans. Research on the racial wealth gap demonstrates that it is not the result of poor financial decisions on the part of people of color, nor did it happen by accident. The racial wealth gap was created and persists as a result of policies, programs, and institutional practices that were designed to facilitate the wealth accumulation of white families while impeding wealth building or stripping wealth from families of color. And I can go into more detail about this during the Q&A. Wealth or net worth is what you, I'm sorry. I feel like the campaigner who lost page 7. Poverty alleviation is necessary, but not sufficient. The ability to stay out of poverty requires more than just a flow of income from a job, particularly a job that pays low wages and no benefits. Upward mobility requires wealth. a stock of resources that can be tapped to pay for an emergency car repair so that an individual can get to work, or sustain a family during a job loss, or cover medical expenses without going into debt. Wealth also allows families to pay for investments like higher education, a home, or retirement savings, or even a business. The goal of our work should not be survival. It should be economic and social upward mobility.
Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about the causes of income and wealth inequality, and this is drawing from a book that I just published a couple of months ago called A Republic of Equals with Princeton University Press. And in that book, I argue that political inequality is the fundamental cause for the extreme inequality that we see in the United States compared to other countries, other rich democracies anyway, in terms of income and wealth. And it relates to race as well as broader inequalities across groups. And with respect to race, it's clear that a set of legal institutions and historical policies, that some of which continue into today, have denied Black Americans equal access to housing markets in particular, as well as high-quality public services and education. So with respect to housing markets, segregation peaked around 1970 between blacks and whites in the United States, and is still extremely high today. And when you compare segregation levels across countries, you see that the United States really stands out compared to European countries. And in my analysis of Gallup World Poll data, we asked people to subjectively rate the quality of their neighborhoods, and the disparity in the United States is 12th out of 162 countries if you compare subjective neighborhood quality of low-income people to high-income people, and that disparity is higher than in every OECD country. So there's clearly something unique about both class and race segregation in the United States. And in research I've done with Andre Perry and David Harshberger of the Brookings Institution, we look at how this has affected wealth in Black neighborhoods. And so in research that we published last year, we analyzed housing values in every US metropolitan area with majority Black neighborhoods. We controlled for the square footage of the home, the characteristics of the home that one could observe through census data and other records. And we also controlled for neighborhood qualities, including the average test scores of students at schools in the neighborhood. And what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23% relative to what a similar home in a similar quality neighborhood would be in a non-Black neighborhood. And that added up to roughly $156 billion in cumulative annual losses in wealth for Black neighborhoods. In subsequent research that we hope to publish shortly in the next month or so, we're looking at businesses in Black neighborhoods, and we obtained Yelp data and as a measure of business quality, we found that highly rated businesses in Black neighborhoods experience significantly less revenue growth than even low-rated businesses in white neighborhoods. So in both of these instances, Black Americans are denied the benefits of participating in markets in the same way as others, and segregation is playing a big role in that. And then the other part of the analysis that I emphasize in the book, which we'll get into more in the question and answer period, is looking at some of the ways that professional elites have rigged markets to benefit themselves through their lobbying associations. So I spend a fair amount of time talking about the American Bar Association and American Medical Association and the policies that they've advocated for throughout the 20th century, and how that's translated into disproportionate income for lawyers and doctors. Also look at other professional groups, including hedge fund managers. But if you just look at the occupations of the people who are in the top 1%, who have seen most of the income gains over the last few decades, the number one occupation is doctors. 15% of people in the top 1% are doctors. Lawyers are not far behind at 7% of the top 1%. CEOs across all industries and groups represent 11%. And what's interesting about CEOs is that many people might assume that it's corporate CEOs, it's the executives of Fortune 500 companies. But when you think about the vast expanse of the top 1%, we're talking about over 1 million people. There are only 500 Fortune 500 companies. And what's also notable is that the corporate share of income has been falling, and increasingly business owners are much more likely to be owners of S corporations, small corporations with few shareholders that are not publicly traded, than they are to be executives of corporations or international multinational corporations. And that matters because these sorts of S corporations enjoy regulatory benefits that are often determined by states that give them certain privileges in the market that other participants don't have.
I'll explain this in a minute. I want to say something about what Jason Furman referred to as the power to the people argument for wealth taxes. And the idea is that extremely unequal wealth undermines democracy. And so a wealth tax might or might not have something to do with reducing that inequality. And of course, later, both in this panel and the next panel, one thing we want to do is talk about to what extent wealth tax would in fact reduce inequality. But assuming that it does, the starting point is in democratic political systems, the core idea is that everybody has equal influence over who runs the government, what kinds of policies they pursue. But in the US system, probably more than in most other political systems, money leads to political influence. The more money people have, the more they influence public policy. And it follows logically that the more unequal income and wealth are, and wealth may actually be more important in this regard than income, the more unequal they are, the more unequal political influence is, the less democracy. And this has real consequences for our lives, for kinds of public policy, and I'll talk about that specific policy in a minute. But the policies that wealthy people and high-income people tend to favor are often very different from what majorities of Americans want. And there's evidence that the wealthy and high-income people tend to get what they want. So this set of graphs is supposed to illuminate that question. I think it's based on the best available evidence on how political influence varies by income level. It comes from Martin Gillen's data on 1,779 cases of federal policy making. Each case is based on a survey question in a national survey so that you can tell what Americans at the middle of the income distribution, on the average, what they want. You can tell what people high in the income distribution want. That means the top 20%, roughly, what people at the 90th percentile want. And these cases cover all sorts of policies, whether it's money spent on public schools, or should we invade Iraq, or abolish the estate tax, the whole range of public policy. Gillen's and I used these survey data on what average income people want, what high income people want, and also his index of how organized interest groups lined up. An index based essentially on how many major groups were in favor and how many were opposed to a proposed policy change that was asked about in a survey. And the main results are shown here. And just to be clear, the dependent variable, Gillen's looked at what actually happened. What kinds of, was there adoption of policies in line with the policy proposal at hand? And so the dependent variable, we did a multiple regression. Dependent variable is the probability that a policy was enacted given the preferences of these three sets of actors: middle-income people, high-income people, and organized interest groups. These are the main results. If you look at the high-income Americans graph, you can see that controlling for the other groups, high-income people tended to get their way. That curve rises from the left to the right. If very few high-income people supported a policy change, it was very unlikely to happen. If a whole lot of them supported a policy change, it was very likely to happen. The same thing is true of interest groups. To the lower right, the curve goes up to the right. That means when more interest groups, organized interest groups, favored a policy, it was more likely to be adopted. And we separated types of interest groups. It turns out that business-oriented groups and corporations were much more influential than mass membership organizations like NAACP or Common Cause, Sierra Club, and so forth. Individual corporations were included, and associations of business, oil industry, financial, defense contractors, and so forth, had a lot of influence on public policy. But then you look at the graph at the top, taking account of the others, middle-income Americans had almost no effect at all on the making of public policy. It didn't matter whether nobody favored a change or almost everybody favored a change. The action all came from high-income Americans and interest groups.
You know, this actually kind of gets to one of the first points that I was hoping to make with you, which is why wealth inequality is such an important policy issue. And this chart seems to be getting to that. Absolutely,
absolutely. And then very quickly, this next one is long and complicated. You may want to look at it online. There's sort of a handout.
And all of these slides are online.
All the slides are online. But the essence of this is a different set of data shows that multimillionaires tend to want policies that are very different from the general public. Each one of these is an example of a survey question that was asked of multimillionaires in the so-called CSIS study. That's the first column, the percentage of multimillionaires who favored a given policy. The second column is the percentage of the public. The third column is the difference between the two. And it's got a sign because the public percentage is subtracted from the millionaires' percentage. That means a minus sign means that millionaires are less supportive of this than the public. And if you look at the details, you'll see in many cases, majorities of the public favor policies that majorities of millionaires oppose. That's true of pretty much all those jobs and income policies. It's true of the healthcare policies. It's true of expanding Social Security. And then there's a second part to this, which is education policy. Amazing to me is how much support there is for public schools among the general American public, and it's just not there among millionaires.
So I want to get back to some of these points a bit later, but if I can bring in the rest of the panel, I'm
Sure.
wondering if you two can talk to why this matters to policymakers. Why does wealth inequality, the way it stands today in the United States, matter? Because as we've heard, a lot of the money that they're getting for their campaigns is coming from the very wealthy.
So wealth inequality impedes upward mobility, which flies in the face of the American dream. And research has shown that contrary to our belief that families are gaining in mobility, in fact, 40% of families who have children who are born, or let me say it a different way, 40% of those who were born into the income bracket on the bottom remain at the bottom. 40% of those who are born into the income bracket at the top stay at the top. And for African American families, there's a much greater likelihood that their children will not achieve even the same rung on the ladder that the parents have achieved. So this goes against what I think many policymakers would like to advocate to their constituents, that there is this American dream that's possible.
Jonathan, the gap has been expanding, for decades now. The rich getting richer, the wealthier getting wealthier, and the poor getting poorer. Why does it keep growing?
Well, I think there are many reasons for that that are somewhat complicated, and it's not entirely clear, and even measuring when it started growing is not entirely clear. But from what I can tell, using both Social Security Administration data and tax data from Tomas Piketty and others, it took off. Income inequality took off between the 70s, around the 70s and 1980s, and there have been a lot of things happening in the economy that have coincided with that aren't necessarily strongly related to the causal factors. One is increasing globalization. The problem with that story is that other countries that have seen rising global integration have much less inequality than the United States and have not seen nearly the same rise. The other complicated aspect of that makes me think it's not such a strong cause is that when you look at the firms that are responsible for employing people in the top 1%, they're decreasingly in the manufacturing sector, and so they're not really the sector of the economy that would have benefited from greater access to global markets. It's really the domestic sector, and so that and some other considerations lead me to believe that what's really happened is the accumulation of political power over many decades through lobbying efforts and ways of distorting markets. So, for example, doctors and lawyers have a monopoly on the professional services that they provide. You have to go through very expensive schooling to compete with them. Immigration laws make it very easy for a software engineer to come to the United States, but make it very difficult for a lawyer or doctor to come work in the United States. Likewise, a number of paralegal or technician types of occupations are prohibited from providing services that they're educated to provide because of the licensing laws that the American Bar Association and other industries have put in place. And then one also has to say that the financialization of the economy has played some role, and the rise of hedge funds, which started in 1950s. Hedge funds have managed to charge 2 and 20 for almost this entire period, which means that they get 20% of the gains to the account and 2% for just managing the money. That's started to come down slightly in recent years, but if you compare those types of fees to what, say, a Vanguard or a mutual fund are offering that have direct connections to investors, to ordinary investors, not just rich investors, the fees are dramatically lower, and it's kind of a strange mystery as to why hedge funds have been able to perpetuate such large gains. And they're really skimming from, in many ways, unionized workers, because union pension funds are some of the biggest customers of hedge funds, and there's been a pretty massive transfer of wealth from ordinary Americans and union members to those managers. So those are some of the factors that I would point to.
And you had some to add?
Well, first, a quick comment about the earlier question you raised. How exactly does money turn into influence on public policy? I think it's important to remember that it's not only through campaign donations. That's probably important. I suspect that's only roughly a third of what happens. Lobbying, a lot more money is spent on lobbying actually than is spent on campaign contributions. And furthermore, really wealthy people can influence politics in much more subtle ways by giving money to think tanks and foundations and so forth, by shaping public discourse, by influencing academics, even like some of us, possibly with grants and so forth. So the channels of political influence are several and very important. And that takes me to Jonathan's points about the role of public policy in increased inequality of both income and wealth. I think it's a profound role, and it's often underestimated. And you can divide the effects in two kind of analytically. One is the familiar one, public policy that has to do with redistribution or not redistributing wealth after taxes and spending. And that's the thing we mostly focus on, tax policy, spending policy. And as everyone knows, the United States is different from most wealthy countries in doing much less for poor people, much less for middle-income people in terms of spending, also for having less progressive taxes on wealth and high income. But more subtle than that is the great effects of politics on the rules by which the market operates. And Jonathan alluded to a few examples of that having to do with quasi-monopolistic practices by various professions that are allowed by law. There are many, many other ways, patent and copyright law, antitrust law, and a number of other ways in which what we think of as a pre-government distribution of income is not really pre-government. Collective bargaining might be the most important thing. The weakness of organized labor in the United States in affecting wages is very different from most of the rest of the world. And that has a whole lot to do with public policy that's weakened unions.
Kalolo, the racial and ethnic disparities in the wealth gap persist. What's feeding into that from a policy perspective?
So as I mentioned in my opening comments, the racial wealth gap was created and it persists as a result of structural racism. And these are the policies, programs, and institutional practices that were designed to create wealth for white families while simultaneously impeding or stripping wealth from families of color. And so this includes going all the way back to the human trafficking and bondage of people of African descent, to the black codes that prohibited black people from opening lucrative businesses, to white mob violence against not only individuals, but whole black communities that destroyed both individual and community wealth. For Latinos, it includes huge land loss from the Manifest Destiny period. It includes being encouraged to come to engage in jobs during wars, but then being deported thereafter for Asian Americans. There were fines and fees and taxes that made them less competitive with whites historically, and then during World War II, the internment camps for Japanese Americans, which meant a loss of their possessions and wealth for Native Americans, the huge loss of not only land but natural resources as a result of wars and treaties and displacement, including the Homestead Act that created great wealth for many, mostly white people. And so those are some of the historical policies, but that persists today. So take, for example, the targeting of communities of color for subprime loans, even when families were eligible for prime loans. This led to huge loss of homes and equity, and some of the lowest or some of the greatest disparity in home ownership between white households and African American households today.
And that's crucial because most people who have any kind of wealth, if they do have it, are holding it in their homes or maybe in a retirement account. Can you talk about more of the obstacles for people who maybe don't already have some wealth to get it in those ways at this point?
So since I talked a little bit about housing, and I think you'll probably be able to add a lot more, and you already have, I'll talk a little bit about retirement savings. So research by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College shows that similarly situated workers of color and white workers participate in and contribute to retirement plans similarly. However, workers of color are rarely similarly situated. African Americans, regardless of level of education, are more likely to face unemployment, lower wages, occupational segregation. And with respect to occupational segregation, we're talking about being employed in jobs that are less likely to offer benefits like retirement savings accounts. So as a result, there are less opportunities to build this kind of wealth, to engage in retirement savings.
And Jonathan, can you talk more about some of the barriers, especially on the housing side of things?
Yeah, so one is that, particularly for African Americans, the effect of segregation on the housing assets is pretty significant. The other thing that I think it's really important to emphasize is the weak income growth for the middle class, and that's really, you can see it maybe most clearly if you look at rising costs of necessities like healthcare, housing, and education. So my analysis of the census data shows that in 1960, the median ratio of rental prices to family income was only 17%, and it rose to 23% in 1980, and now it's at 31% in 2018. So it's just a fact that people are spending much more of their income on housing, and that means less money for savings and for investment, and so households are more reliant on their employer contributing to a 401k plan and that sort of thing. But then that's not happening as much as it was in the 1980s, according to census data. Employers are actually less likely to be contributing to the average worker's retirement plan, and part of that could be linked to the large number of people who are self-employed. That analysis gets a little bit complicated because it seems like self-employment has largely increased as a result of employed people taking on more self-employment income, but in any case,
You mean like the gig economy?
Yeah,
and
that's
like
right.
That?
But there's, in any case, access to those retirement benefits is less now than it used to be, which I think is a major problem when paired with kind of stagnating incomes once you consider the rising costs of healthcare and housing.
When you're thinking about sort of obstacles to building wealth for people at the bottom, what jumps to your mind? Sorry, Ben.
Who are you
Yeah,
asking?
sorry, Ben.
You're asking me?
Apologies.
I'm not the right person to answer that question, but if I could, I'll answer a different one.
Go for it.
Which is back to the causes of increased inequality of income and wealth. I think Jonathan and I have a little bit different views about globalization and automation. I mean, I think of those as really fundamental forces that have been affecting all advanced countries. Basically, when you have a global labor market with very low wages on the average, that's opened up over the years to compete with the workers in advanced countries, it's not surprising that there's pressure on ordinary people's wages and jobs. And at the same time, another result of that, automation, of course, does a similar thing. Both automation and global economic competition increase the power of the owners of businesses, the owners of capital, as opposed to workers, pretty much around the world. So politics becomes very important in what happens next. And if you look across advanced countries, all of them face essentially the same pressures from globalization and automation. But other countries have just done very different things about it. And that's why you see these cross-national differences. Other countries have tried to equalize to some degree to compensate for those pressures by helping lower and middle income people and by taxing high income people.
So obviously there's been a lot of discussion about the wealth tax already, and several of the Democratic presidential candidates have laid out their plans with different tiers for what taxes would apply at each level, with particularly extra taxes on billionaires as opposed to the millionaires. Ben, are there different ways, based on your research, you talked about the different ways that the wealthy influence politics and how it shows up. Is there a difference between what millionaires and billionaires do?
Yes, and I must say, it's very important to keep track of these percentages. Like when we see graphs of the top 10%, that's a whole lot of people. The top 1% is a lot of people. In the United States, it's not just 1 million, it's like 3.5 million, something like that. The 1% in America are not super rich. Last I looked, you had to have about $10 million in assets to be in the top 1%.
I think that's still super rich.
To most of us, that's a lot of money. But in America, my heavens, there are 569 billionaires. A billionaire has 100 times as much as somebody who has $10 million. But it makes a difference. It makes a difference politically. You know, and Jason Furman was saying, well, maybe, you know, inequality at the top, maybe it doesn't make a difference whether Bezos has half as much money. I'm skeptical about that. I think for one thing, there is the argument about it'd be nice to have some revenue from these wealthy people, and I'm very favorable to that. But I think it's also a good idea to consider ways of reducing that inequality.
But politically, do they behave differently, millionaires versus billionaires?
Yes, to some degree this is true. Now, the slides that we didn't really have time to talk about, that was multimillionaires, roughly the top 1 or 2%. It's a random sample, and it's about the best data we have, but it's small, and it's actually a local sample, Chicago area. So we don't know a whole lot about what billionaires want. In the handout, there's some slides about billionaires that you could get online. But we had to study billionaires just by looking at their public statements and their reported actions, because you can't do a survey of them. And the behavior that's different is they spend a lot more money on politics. That matters. On the other hand, what they want is not so different from what the multimillionaires want, as we found in the CISA survey.
Which is different than what most people want.
There's a big difference between both those groups and average people. And I'm not sure I made the point explicitly that that difference leads to public policies that are not only against the will of the majority, but they're policies that tend to reinforce or increase inequality, like less progressive taxes, less spending to subsidize jobs and wages of lower income people.
Jonathan, what do most Americans think about a wealth tax?
They seem to like it based on the polling data that I've seen and that Gallup has done. Although there are sort of complicated views among the public, you know, from a big picture on what to do about these kinds of issues. Most people think that income inequality and wealth inequalities are too high in the United States, but at the same time, people will respond favorably to questions like, should there be rich people, or is it okay? Is it helpful that there are millionaires in the United States and that people can get rich? And they'll say, yes, that is a good thing. So a lot of it comes down, you know, kind of stepping aside from that. There's a really interesting polling data that Gallup did in collaboration with the Norwegian School of Economics, where in a large number of countries around the world, we asked people, first of all, if they think the distribution of income is unfair in their country, and then gave them scenarios where they could redistribute based on a couple of different experimental scenarios, one in which it was clear that somebody had made a greater contribution and thus deserved more money in some way, and then other scenarios where people had equal contributions to producing something. And basically what we found is that throughout the world, people think the income distribution is unfair, but people are okay with some level of income inequality if it's based on merit. And so I think that's actually a really crucial thing to think about in terms of tax policy. It's a fairly blunt instrument to say we're going to tax every millionaire or billionaire the same, regardless of how they earn their money. I'm much more concerned about groups or individuals that have accumulated a fortune by taking advantage of a rigged market system, whether it's monopolies or the kind of state regulations on licensing, than I am the millionaires and billionaires who created a company that has delivered huge benefits to consumers and contributed greatly to economic growth and the living standards of ordinary people. And I think normal people, or who we kind of survey and poll, the median voter, if you like, probably feels kind of similarly about that. So if there's a way to target tax policies or regulatory reforms or political reforms on eliminating the non-meritorious aspects of income and wealth accumulation, I think that would go a lot further politically.
So just very quickly, I want to check in with Kalolo. Let's just say in a magical world, a wealth tax passes that everybody's okay with, and suddenly the Treasury is flooded with all of this new revenue. Are there policies that we know about now where you could use that money and actually bring up some of those people at the bottom?
So baby bonds is a proposal that's been offered by Derek Hamilton, who is the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And baby bonds would be an endowment that would be provided to every newborn, but it would be scaled based on the wealth of that baby's family. So a baby born into a low-wealth family would get approximately $60,000. A baby born into an affluent family, maybe just $500. It would be an endowment that would be managed by the government, not unlike Social Security, and made available to the young adult who could then use it to purchase an asset building investment such as higher education, a home, or retirement savings or a business. This has been proposed by Senator Cory Booker, the American Opportunity Account. There has been a study done by Naomi Zode that shows that currently young white adults have about 15 times the wealth of young black adults. Under the baby bond proposal, they would have about 1.5 times the amount. And there have been some cost estimates done. The Booker's office estimates that it would cost about $60 billion per year. The Center for Responsible Federal Budget estimates about $650 billion over a decade, so that's approximately the same. Booker includes some tax changes that the center indicates would cover that cost.
I'm sorry, Ben, you had another point you wanted to add on the previous question, I think? No? Okay. Well, I don't want to take too much away from the policy discussion that's coming up next, but very quickly, any other things that, given what we know of the numbers from the presidential candidates in terms of what they're saying we might get from a potential wealth tax, are there sort of easy wins of things to do with that money that could meaningfully affect income inequality or sorry, the wealth gap?
I'm a proponent of early childhood education, and it's something that we have in D.C. that's funded by local taxes, not by the federal government. But I can imagine the federal government using, say, a revenue windfall to incentivize financially, without necessarily paying the full costs of local universal pre-K. And I think that would, the evidence is pretty clear that that would have a really important effect on the educational trajectories and upward mobility of low-income people around the country.
And I guess very quickly before we go to the Q&A, and this is a question for you, Ben, given the way that the wealthy influence politics, how might they respond to someone actually trying to pass something like that?
They'd make it hard, that's for sure. And that gives me a chance to say that the wealth tax is not the only way to deal with this problem. Political reforms are probably very important before you can do much of anything to deal with inequality. And of course, wealthy people will resist democratic reforms too, but there's a whole menu of things that could be done to reduce the power of money in politics and increase the power of ordinary people.
Thank you all so much. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions. So please just wait for someone to bring you the mic. I will call on you. And for those watching online, you can submit your questions to events@urban.org. And for those of you following along on social media, our hashtag is #live@urban. We're going to start all the way in the back with the young lady on the wall, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My question for the panel is, what are your thoughts on reparations as a potential solution to the racial wealth gap in America?
Why doesn't everyone answer?
So what I will say is that at this point, that's not an area of expertise for me, so I don't want to jump into it as if it were, but I guess I'll be a little bit controversial and say I think it's inevitable.
I would love for you to expand on that.
I believe that it is inevitable that the debt that is due to people of African descent, whom I just said, have their labor has been used as the means to create wealth for white families, that it is inevitable that there will be reparations to African American families.
Ben?
I think it'll work best without that label, though, politically, and Jonathan may have something to say about Gallup polls and this sort of question. A reaction that you get from most white Americans is, but I wasn't around, I didn't own any slaves. And to explain that their ancestors and the whole economy benefited from slavery, and it really makes sense to compensate now, that argument's a tough sell politically, and it seems to me we should do reparations without calling it that. And there are many small policies, some of which we've been mentioning, that move in that direction.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I don't know what the polling data show on it off the top of my head. I'd say it would very much depend on the actual proposals, because you can imagine quite a range of what those policies would look like if they were implemented. But I think there would be support, and I think there is maybe some inevitability to policies that disproportionately benefit African Americans. Yeah. And I think I agree with Ben as to whether they're framed explicitly as reparations or something else will affect their political popularity and potentially whether or not they get implemented.
We're going to go to the gentleman here in the grayish sweater, and then the gentleman in the white shirt over there.
Thank you very much, Larry Checco. I'm wondering if ROI has anything to do with billionaires and high wealth people not wanting to pay their taxes, meaning that they don't get a high enough return on their investment when it comes to taxes. For example, Ben, you mentioned private education. Most wealthy people send their kids to private schools. Transportation. Most of them don't take the metro like I do. You can go into health insurance. A lot of these wealthy people really self-insure. So they're saying, why should we, pay taxes for these services that we gain nothing from? So how do we change that mindset, I guess is my question.
Well, I think that's right. You could call that simple, rational self-interest, and there probably is a major motive for not caring about public schools, for example. How to change that, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of efforts to convert people's values. I think you change it by public policy. Simply say, a majority of Americans should make the policy, not billionaires.
Gentleman here.
Oh, thank you so much for your comments and research. My name's Carl Pulzer, and since reading Piketty's book, I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity, which I explore wealth concentration, but I advocate for the bottom, not necessarily going after the top. And when you do that, when you take on the bottom, you find it's not just people of color, it's not just people on the streets, it's people of all types. Mm-hmm. And I'm coming to the conclusion that, and I tend to be left, but the way that the research is funded, because so much of a lens through the minorities and women, it doesn't. It's funded that way, and it gets into the newspaper that way, and it's not resonating with the part of the low-income vote that voted for Trump.
So
and if you really want to, the question is, if you really want to influence the future, shouldn't we be doing research more on poor people generally? Mm-hmm. I don't dispute that
so
black people.
So the question is should the research on poverty and lack of wealth be focused more broad range as opposed to the racial and ethnic differences that
or add a
exist
white
in the
trash category, a code.
So the slides that I presented started out looking at everyone and then went to race and ethnicity. I didn't include slides about gender, but there's also data on gender, which includes white women. But yes, the greatest disparities are between the races. The proposal that I offered in terms of baby bonds would be universal, which means that every newborn would receive an endowment based on the wealth of their families. So low wealth babies born into white families would receive that large endowment.
Yes, ma'am. We'll just wait for a mic, please.
Thank you very much. Two questions. One, I think, or wouldn't it be helpful if someone did an ongoing survey of how expensive it is to be poor? And by that, I mean, if you have to buy one roll of toilet paper at 7-Eleven versus 20 at Costco, you're paying more. Freddie Gray's apartment probably was more expensive than lots of other people. It is expensive to be poor. Mm-hmm. So my question is, couldn't there be more done to clarify to the wealthy that it's actually expensive to be poor, and that now it takes 2 and 3 incomes to be even lower middle class?
There was a study done on called Financial Diaries that followed households, low-income households, and just that, collected information on what they were spending and their diaries and what things were costing. And there's a book that was written about that. And I'm sorry, I'm not thinking of the authors right now. Jonathan Murdoch and Rachel Schneider, was it? Anyway, yes, it's been done.
Is there any research sort of about how the wealthy perceive, the cost of poverty in any that you guys have come across? Because, I mean, this is a common question. People are like, oh, very wealthy people don't understand how expensive it is to be poor. And we have plenty of evidence that, if you're poor, you will pay higher fees or you'll pay more of your income as a share of your income for things that the wealthy will not. I mean, how does that show up in your research in terms of what it means for the wealth gap? Either of you? Anybody?
I haven't seen surveys that frame it that way, but I think that would be really interesting to try to understand more about misperceptions that the wealthy might have.
I should think it's probably true of most of the population, not just the wealthy. The stigmatizing the poor has been around for quite a while. And that's part of it, not understanding, first of all, that most poor Americans are working poor. And secondly, not understanding things about what their life circumstances are like, what their expenses are like, and so forth.
Yeah, I will say that I think that you're precisely right in that there needs to be a different narrative, a change in the narrative that depicts the experience of low-income people and what the challenge is in terms of the expenses that they face.
And if I could just add one thing, I mean, that is a theme that I've tried to get across as well, is that full access to markets is something that we don't currently have. And it's particularly evident in housing because zoning policies prohibit the construction of middle-class housing in many neighborhoods throughout the country. And that effectively prevents poor and middle-class people from participating equally. And I think that's something that's not well understood or appreciated.
The gentleman has a question up here, and then we'll come over to you.
So knowing that intergenerational wealth can impact and exacerbate social and economic conditions, do y'all think that the universal basic income policy would be a reasonable and effective way to target that?
Go for it.
I'll say something. The word automation that I uttered and then ran by should make us think about the future of jobs in America. And my view is that the production of wealth and income is a cooperative activity that pretty much everybody in society participates in, including through the taxes they pay for public education and so forth. And so my view is that wealth should be shared. And one way of doing that as jobs vanish is something like a universal basic income.
So I would just say one thing. I've been persuaded by Melissa Kearney's analysis of this. She's a Brookings Institution fellow in the University of Maryland. Her analysis basically concludes that it would be much less efficient to have a universal basic income system than to have either our current redistributive system or one that sort of beefed up to better support low-income people. And one of the...
Like EITC?
Yes, like EITC.
Definitely.
And one of the crucial parts of the analysis is that if you really play out universal basic income as it's been proposed, what ends up happening is that you'd end up giving a lot of money to otherwise healthy people who were capable of working, but for whatever reason were not working. And they may have been relatively high or middle income at some point before that. And it ends up transferring money to people that you wouldn't necessarily want to prioritize if your goal was to raise the welfare of the lowest income.
We had two questions together here. Let's grab you both.
I just want to say first off, there was this really strange moment in my mind when Jason was speaking where I was thinking to myself, I wonder what the Gillens and Page study would weigh in on this question of political influence being indeterminate. Well, and then when you were speaking, Ben, it was like this most like Martin Gillens. I was like, oh my God, I'm actually hearing that analysis right afterwards. So that was wonderful. But my question is, it seems that if an economist does a study using their skill set, they might come to the conclusion that political influence does not play a part in the actions of the wealthy, and by reducing wealth, you do not reduce political influence of the wealthy. Simultaneously, a political scientist might then be able to take this research and say, well, no, actually, it's more about the status quo, and there are other ways through which lobbying there is influence that can't be measured by an economist, and then simultaneously discount structural racism as being integral to that status quo. Does it seem to you that there are ways in which sociologists, economists, and political scientists can come together to create more fruitful policy solutions that are interdisciplinary in nature?
Well, look what we have right here.
But it still seems like there's like gaps, sorry.
Let's examine the premise there, though. Is it actually the case that economists have evidence that's contrary to the Gillens type evidence? I don't think so. I don't know of other convincing studies of political influence, but maybe I'm just missing them.
Right next.
I'm Edward Cowan. I'm a retired New York Times economics writer. Lolo, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'd like to come to something I understood you to say in your opening remarks that the race gap in income and the race gap in wealth in the United States are consequences of specific government, federal government policies. Could you give us some examples? If I have that right, could you give us some examples, please?
So, yeah, so I did mention some, but I'll go, I'm happy to go back through. So I mentioned the, going back to our initial presence in the US, our being people of African descent, the trafficking, the human trafficking and bondage of people of African descent, which was legal and was done to create wealth for white families, certainly didn't benefit people of African descent at all. Yes, yeah, and I say it in those terms because for me, the term slavery has lost any kind of meaning, connotation of the magnitude of the atrocity. So I describe it as what it was. And then, you know, even after the legal end of slavery, there was the continued black codes in which there was huge loss of land, property, assets through violence to individuals and to families and to whole communities. There was the prohibition of people of African descent going into occupations that were lucrative, businesses that were lucrative, and
I think she's already covered in her statements and her opening statements and throughout, and
yeah,
all of you have given examples
so
of this.
I will refer you to there within the slides that I have. It wasn't on this slide, but there is a slide that I think was included in what's online. There is a document called "The Color of Wealth in the Nation's Capital," and it documents policies, regulations, Supreme Court decisions, institutional practices from the inception of DC through 2010 that created the wealth gap in Washington, D.C. So that'll give you a better sense.
And I believe our keynote had a question.
Jason Furman again. Maybe because I didn't explain myself well enough the first time, I'll try again and then make it a question. I tried to cite your research in a pretty quick way when I said I don't think there's any dispute whatsoever that the rich have more power. They meet with their members of Congress more, they donate more. When you look at decisions, they get their way more. Across the board, I think that evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether that would be made better and by how much through the tax system. There's a lot of ways, political reform, et cetera, that are beyond the scope of this discussion in this room that I think a lot of people would agree would make that better. The question is, can taxes help with that? To that end, I guess I had sort of three analytical questions, Ben, that you and others would have a view on. Number one, how much power comes from the fact that somebody is a CEO or a successful local business person as compared to the actual amount of money they have? The tax system will change one of those facts about them, not the other. My own experience, by the way, separate from the political science literature, is the auto dealers were a fearsome lobby because they were in every single congressional district. They're rich, but they're not billionaires. The community banks are very powerful. The retirement investment community. These are the issues where the community just got its way. So one, how much is sort of position, role versus the amount of money you have in the bank? The second is that question I had, how much is it that the top 400 people are going to be powerful versus anyone who has over $1 billion will be powerful? The tax system can help with one, not with the other. And the last, I think it's an open empirical question, what it did to donations. But if we did something that cut wealth in half, but increased donations by 50%, donations for political advocacy, donations for political campaigns, donations for issue advocacy, in your view, would that increase the power or reduce the power of the wealthy? And I'm saying if that's the case, because I think that's an empirical question and we don't know whether what I just described is realistic. So sort of, is it your position Is it where you are in the income distribution versus how much you have? And what would happen if you had less money, but you gave more of it for politics and issues?
Good questions. Last one first. On donations, that's actually why I mentioned the multiple pathways of influence. So that's a clever argument that there could be.
Donations, I mean, to advocacy too.
But his earlier point was that it's not just donations, it's advocacy, it's lobbying, it's also
That's
sort of
true,
think
but
tanks and things.
But that all costs money.
Lobbying.
50% more of all of that stuff.
Yes, but your argument was don't worry too much, don't imagine that a wealth tax will reduce the power of donations. Wasn't that one?
I'm just stipulating, everyone has 50% less wealth.
Right.
They do 50% more of all the things that cost money to increase their power in society. 50% more political donations, 50% more charitable, 50% more lobbying, all of that, because the relative price of all of that has fallen. Substitution effect says do more. So that's the question.
Fair
I don't
enough.
know if that's gonna
I
happen.
can't deny that that's an empirical question. It would be really interesting to answer. And I think we have different intuitions about it.
Okay, so we're running out of time, so maybe you could just tackle that first one, which is this idea of how much of this political influence is about the wealth and how much of it is about who is wealthy and where they stand in a given society, and quickly, because we're just about out of time.
It's hard to know, of course. I think there's a closely related issue that's very important in this, and that is it has to do with the incentive effects of wealth taxes and whether people would keep saving and investing and building the economy. And I think actually people's rank, their social prestige is very crucial, and that's probably the major incentive. And that's actually a reason why you shouldn't worry too much about reducing the spread of rewards. This applies to income as well as wealth, because people will still work very hard to be entrepreneurs. All the entrepreneurs I know would have worked if they had half the income and half the wealth that they have now.
All right, thank you to Ben Page, Jonathan Rothwell, and Kalelo Kizikazi. Never gonna get it right, I'm sorry. And we are going to take a short break now. And so, yes, thank you all.
Everyone, if we could please start making your way back to your seats. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Amara Amokwe, and I'm an economics reporter at the Wall Street Journal. This second panel is going to focus on how government policy and tax policy in particular could potentially address some of these issues around wealth inequality that we've been hearing about this morning. And so before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Eugene Sterling, who's an Institute Fellow here at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Next, we have Douglas Holtz-Aiken. He's president of the American Action Forum. And last, we have Chai-Ching Wang. She's director of federal fiscal policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So welcome to our panelists.
Thank you.
We're going to get started with a brief opening statement from each of our panelists. Then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll have Q&A with the audience. And if you are watching online, you can submit questions to events@urban.org. Eugene, why don't you lead us off with your opening statement?
Well, thank you. Thank you. Delightful to be on such an illustrious panel here. I'm going to make a statement that basically proceeds from the notion that we do care about wealth inequality for reasons that were raised by the last panel. There's some people who might disagree with that, but I'm going to start right there. But I'm going to make some other statements that might be a little more controversial. I'm going to argue, for reasons even beyond the ones that Kalolo raised, that it's both government tax and transfer policy that's partly responsible for the increase in wealth inequality. And I'm going to argue also that this partly is related to what our policy does today on the transfer side vis-a-vis what it did in the past, that we're decreasingly putting money into things that would be investment and opportunity, mobility, housing, education, and so forth, even though we are actually spending more in terms of social welfare types of policies. So I'm going to label this a tale of two populations, and I'm going to argue, and admittedly this is simplifying, that we have two broad sets of policies towards two populations in the economy. Towards the very wealthy, the major effort at the top has been basically to decrease and minimize taxes on the returns to capital. I don't want to exaggerate the decrease. We've never taxed them greatly at the individual level, although we did tax them a lot more at the corporate level. But the policy there has been to cut taxes on the returns from capital. That low rate of taxation on capital, by the way, and returns from capital applies to lower income people. It's just that lower income people don't have enough capital that makes a lot of difference. The other policy we've had has been a significant increase in transfer policy, particularly in the years leading up to, say, the late 70s. But even since then, we're spending twice as much on transfers in real dollars as we did, say, when Ronald Reagan first became president. So we're spending a lot more there. But in terms of this transfer policy, it's largely been oriented towards things that really don't produce wealth. They might indirectly, but their goal is basically to equalize consumption. And one of the great confusions in this debate over inequality is inequality of consumption is not the same as inequality of wage income. It's not the same as inequality of before tax, before transfer income, and it's not the same as inequality of after tax, after transfer income. And if you know that literature well, you know that on the income side, if you count everything, including health spending and everything else, it's not clear that inequality of that income has become worse. It's very clear that inequality of wages, which reflect human capital, and inequality of wealth has increased enormously. Now, there's a legitimate argument for both of these policies towards these populations. At the top, the argument is, you know, if we give $100 to the wealthy, they're much more likely to save that $100 than if we give $100 to the non-wealthy. They're more likely to consume it. And if we care about capital formation, we need to give more to the wealthy. And in many ways, that's the supply side argument. They'll make the argument in terms of incentives, but I would argue it's largely the fact that wealthy just can't consume a lot of their income. They do save a lot. Also, that entrepreneurs who are building a business tend to save the income. So we give more to the wealthy because we really care about capital formation. How about the non-wealthy? Well, we care about social policy. We care about minimum levels of benefits. We like to raise standards of living, so we care a lot about their standards of living. We care about more universal health care, so that's our policy towards the non-wealthy. So you might argue, well, that's not such a bad thing, right? We're both those policies are serving legitimate ends. But what have I left out? What is being left out is what's getting squeezed in the middle. So if you look at government policy today, it's decreasingly emphasizing education, decreasingly emphasizing wealth formation. It's actually not actually promoting much in the way of wage subsidies. Wage subsidies increased a lot, or they're still small relative to things like Social Security and healthcare, but wage subsidies increased a lot in particularly in the late 80s, early 90s. They really haven't grown much after that, even though there's some policies that changed it. As a result, we've abandoned children, inclusive investment in education, human capital formation. Housing and pensions have never been inclusive. They've become even less inclusive for reasons that Cololo felt. And I think that inequality of wages reflects the inequality of mobility, opportunity, what economists often call option value. And that's what really upsets people. People feel like they're basically unempowered. And I think this set of policies is actually right. They have unempowered them. But it's not all just about taxes at the top. It's also about how we distribute what we do to the rest of the population. You know, the average transfers per household in this economy is about $35,000. That's the amount of individual supports. It's about double what we did in the past, but they're not basically oriented towards wealth formation. And I just have two pieces of evidence here. I'm not sure if they're showing up here or not. All right, so the quick piece of evidence on the taxes at the top. This is work I did 30 years ago and then repeated with J.D. Bourne and some colleagues from the Statistics of Income, as well as here in more recent years. If you look at the data here, and I'm just going to point to one thing, if you take people with $100 million or more of wealth, they on average report about 40% of them report less than 1% of that wealth as their returns. So people basically at the individual level don't pay taxes for the most part on their capital income. For middle income people, it's retirement and housing. For high income people, it's basically accrued capital gains. We don't actually tax income from capital very much at the top. And that's one reason people are thinking about wealth taxation as an option. And my last slide, my only other slide, this basically shows you under current law. This is printed in the Washington Post, and the references in your slide deck if you want it. But basically, about 10 years from now, revenues in the United States are expected to grow by about $1.2 trillion under current law. That's real dollars. You could do a lot with that $1.2 trillion to favor things like greater wealth equality, education, human capital formation, things that might increase the wealth of the middle and low-income people. If you look at where the money is going, though, 120% of it, 117%, is scheduled to go for three things only. Social Security, and by the way, that's not just more elderly people, it's higher benefits and more years of retirement. Health, which is absorbing huge portions of the growth. And finally, because we don't collect enough taxes to even pay our bills, interest on the debt is rising. That's where all the growth in government is scheduled. And that's one of the reasons why wealth inequality is getting worse, is that government is not orienting its policies toward increasing the wealth and human capital of our population. Thank you.
Gene's right. And I'm going to stick to my 3 minutes in a disciplined fashion. The panel before basically laid out the fact that the wealth inequality is the outcome of a rich tapestry of social and policy, legal, and economic influences, and the tax system isn't all that rich or complex. It takes money from one place and puts it in another. And the problem with this, the question as it's framed is, I don't know how much wealth to take away from people. I don't know what the right amount of inequality is, and I've got to sit down and write down a tax code that supposedly answers that question. It can't be done. And so I'm not a big fan of that way of thinking about that problem. And I have some concerns about the actual wealth taxes that have been proposed. We just published a paper on this, we can come back to it, about the economic implications of it, which I think are quite unattractive for the average working person going forward. However, there are two things that I really would like to see in tax policy that would, as Gene said, address some of the concerns I have about the inequality that you can see, even if you don't know the right amount that's just, that we should aim for. And they have to do with how we run our tax system. I've always been a fan of progressive consumption-style taxes. which acknowledge the reality that the affluent do save in the United States and we need capital formation. But you can run those one of two ways. You can run them like a traditional IRA, where you think of the tax system as every time you save and invest, you get to take a deduction. When the principal and any earnings come out, it all gets taxed. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is like a Roth, which is you pay your taxes, and then you put it in the account, and when it comes out, you get to keep everything, principal plus whatever earnings you might get. I want to run the whole tax system like a traditional IRA, so that if you have monopoly power, you have a windfall, you have any economic rents, we tax them. And that, I think, would, in a great way, give us an efficient tax system, but one which leads to better progressivity as measured. Second thing I'd like to do is get rid of the estate tax. I've been on a lifelong campaign to get rid of the estate tax. I used to have a good academic distaste for it. I then became the administrator of my brother's estate. I now detest it in a way that I can't even describe. I think it's all wrong. There's a big difference between having $1 trillion and giving it to your son or daughter and having $1 trillion and giving $1 to 1 trillion people. And I think we should have an inheritance tax that reflects how much people get. And we can deal with a lot of the intergenerational inequality in an inherent tax framework much more efficiently and I think much more effectively. So that's what I want to do with the tax system. Forget the wealth taxes.
Maybe not agree. But we'll come back to that later. We'll come back to that. So Janet Holtzblad in her blog for TPC yesterday billed us as the tax geek panel. So thank you for having me, I guess. We'll try to make some of the boring things that Jason Furman relegated, I think, into his last 2 points of sort of boring things, interesting and exciting, because I think there is more than enough there to sort of motivate some of the thinking around some of these proposals we're looking at. So I have 2 sort of key context points, and one of them is that there is more than enough challenges in our current tax code and what that's failing to do relative to our current national needs to motivate thinking about all of these sorts of interesting ideas, but without having to necessarily, I mean, you can, because they're interesting, bring in the other concerns. Revenues as a share of GDP, they're at their lowest level in 50 years outside the immediate aftermath of a Great Recession. We have retiring baby boomers, we have the climate that's changing, we have underinvestments in the areas that Jean talked about, including especially the need for well-designed investments to reduce racial barriers to economic success, as the previous panel talked about. Overall, US taxes, state, local, federal, are at the best modestly progressive or perhaps regressive at the very top end, depending on your measure. And all of that would have been true had we not also spent a couple of years ago $1.9 trillion adding to a whole bunch of those problems in the 2017 tax law. And if you look at that current tax code as sort of your basic perspective, which many tax geeks do, it's really doing very, very poorly at counting and taxing income from wealth. Unlike the tax deducted from the paychecks of workers every pay period or paid in April, very much of the economic income of the very wealthy never shows up on tax returns. And Jean's done some wonderful research on that. The growth and the value of those assets doesn't face tax as that growth occurs. And the very wealthy can pass those gains on to their heirs if they hold on to that long enough. Those gains will never face income tax. And much of the capital income that does show up on tax returns faces very much lower rates than income from work. The IRS has been starved. Enforcement is really at very low levels, and audit rates have plummeted, particularly at the very high end. And then there's the raft of tax breaks that have been mentioned that are supposed to help a broad swath of the population build human and financial assets. Mortgage interest deduction, various tax breaks for higher education, a deduction for pass-through income on those S corporations that we talked about earlier. But they're all really tilted to the top. So they're just basically at the moment acting as a windfall for saving and asset building that would have happened anyway, and that is disproportionately going to white people as well. So this means overall the tax code is doing very much less than it could to raise revenue and reduce racial wealth and income gaps and overall wealth and income gaps than it could. And that's sort of my baseline perspective. There's some really interesting pros and cons of the ideas that we're working through to address those. But the relative to what that's always in my mind is our current national needs and that basic baseline. The second point of context is just that racial wealth gap. I think we've sort of been echoing this throughout the day, is that it will require concerted effort across very many policy fronts. And I do think that fiscal policy has a big role to play. We've heard the way that sort of metric distills a cumulative impact across generations of policies, policy choices, private discrimination, reaching back to that atrocity of chattel slavery, the confiscation of indigenous lands, and carrying through right now to discrimination in credit markets, employment markets, housing markets, and so on and so forth. So that tells me, I think, that we require an equally broad-ranging set of policy changes to address that. And it's very much an and situation. So for me, we need policy that it's explicitly about assets, and because assets accumulate from what's left of your income after you face your expenses, we need policies to boost incomes in the short term and the long term, and to address housing affordability, education affordability, and all of those other expenses that are important too. We need to think both about the public assets and the private assets and human capital. And we need to look at the rungs up and down the entire economic ladder. And so I think the tax system has a role to play in all of those different and areas, and really looking forward to talking about the specifics of how.
So given all that you all have said about the various tools that the government could use to address wealth inequality, I guess how do you look at the wealth tax as aligning with the stated goals of potentially adopting a wealth tax?
Well, let me just say a little bit about what we found when we looked at the Warren and Sanders wealth taxes. So this is work that I commissioned E&Y to do. I chose E&Y because they have the modeling technologies that are comparable to the Joint Committee on Taxation. They're built off consensus estimates in the literature. They are the way these proposals would be treated if they were live legislation in the US Congress. And I thought that was the right way to look at them. And I certainly didn't want to be accused of putting my thumb on the scale. I wanted someone else to do it. So we take at face value some of the things that the proponents wanted. We use their estimates of the fraction of wealth that the individuals have. We use their estimates of the revenue that will be raised. And then we just play out the implications of imposing the wealth taxes on the US economy, and then we're taking the revenue and redistributing it back as transfer programs, the existing transfer programs. What happens is, over time, you accumulate less capital, the economy grows more slowly, productivity is diminished, and real wages decline. And in that way, this is a standard exercise in economic incidence of taxes. The statutory incidence is for the wealthy to send in checks, but over time, the people who bear the burden of that tax are increasingly those who have labor income. They are the workers. And over the long term, they will pay 63 cents of every dollar of wealth tax in diminished real wages. That to me is very unattractive. That's certainly not the goal, the stated goal of this. And it's not shocking if you think about it. These are extremely high tax rates on the return to capital. If you have a Sanders tax, top rate 8%, and you have a rate of return of 8%, it's a 100% tax rate on the annual return to capital. It's draconian annual tax rates. They are chosen to be levied on people who own a disproportionate amount of the investable capital in the economy. It doesn't matter how many people you tax. It matters how much economic activity you tax and how much you distort that economic activity. This is a lot of economic activity with draconian tax rates that has big implications. So, fine, we might want to have other policies to raise more money from the affluent. Don't use these, because they're going to end up backfiring on you, and that's not the goal.
Chai-Ching, do you want to respond to that, the idea that a wealth tax could potentially harm American workers, the very people that a wealth tax is supposed to help?
So, I mean, I think three things that also carry on to other different methods of progressively taxing either wealth or income from wealth, and some that don't. The first is that analysis, while it is standard, doesn't actually tell us who is better or worse off. You need to take into account
consumption declines. Everyone's worse off. We make the affluent worse off, but deliberately with the tax, and we make the average worker worse off because their consumption level declines.
And the transfer policies?
It's not enough to make up for it. If you kill the economy, you don't raise enough money to have good transfers to solve for the fact you killed the economy.
Okay, so I disagree, but maybe we can take this into a blog.
Those are the numbers.
So they are the numbers with a set of assumptions. One set of assumptions is, one that carries through all of the discussion that has set up our tax code the way it is today, with very low or zero rates on a lot of types of capital income. The idea that capital accumulation is very responsive to the after-tax rate of return on that capital. And I just read the literature and the experience differently on what that sensitivity is. So if you want to get geeky because we're the tax panel, the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is a really core parameter in your model. And there's a big question about whether or not to believe that cutting corporate tax rates, cutting capital gains tax rates, dividend tax rates, and not increasing tax rates on them through a variety of different policy measures actually have the impact of increasing investment, increasing productivity, and flowing through to actual returns for workers. There's questions at the very start of that chain, and there's questions all the way through to the end of that chain. And I think that's a really big, important, overarching question for all of these policies. On your actual model, I think there are some interesting choices in there that could be picked apart with varying views on it. So from how I understand your model, you treat the responsiveness of everybody who has a net asset, so about 50% of the population, the same in the model in terms of the effective marginal tax rates they face on their wealth and the sensitivity to which they respond. And I think one of the really important questions that the literature and some of the political discussion is asking us to think about is the ways in which the extremely rich, and again, these policy proposals that you're modelling, only the extremely rich would face them, how they're different than the rest of the population. Do they accumulate more of their return from luck and monopoly and these supernormal returns than other people? Are they more sensitive to price? Are they more sensitive to the stock of wealth that they have or the place that they are in the income distribution? And maybe if I were modelling it, I would do exactly the same thing that you did, because there is a lot of debate about each of those things, but I think it's a really big point of sensitivity within the model to assume that the extremely rich are the same as everyone else. So
I come out a little bit between the two of you. I think
should we
just sit here?
I think there is solid economic argument that if you reduce wealth in the economy, that's going to reduce long run also wages for future labor. On the other hand, there's a case to be made if you do transfers the right way and you increase things like human capital and investment in people, are their own financial capital, their housing, and their other stock, you're increasing wealth. And so that works in the opposite direction. My concern with the wealth tax is that the proponents of the wealth tax, particularly the major advocates, are at least as it's now being designed, aren't dealing with both sides of that question. And as Doug says, in some sense, they are taking the money, but they're transferring the money without much attention to whether those transfers are going to do much for increasing wealth and for the long-term capital formation in the economy. There's a narrow issue here. I don't want to get too technical. What I tried to point out in my comments was there's an income effect that's different than the substitution effect that you're largely talking about, Cha-Ching. There is a case to be made that the rich just save their income, regardless of whether it has any incentive or whether they're going to work more, or whether they're going to try to borrow more money to invest. They basically would just save less money. And so then I'm arguing we need to figure out ways to increase saving for other people in the economy. As for the wealth tax proposals that are out there, though, I think a lot of them are badly designed. They're not complete. They're campaign proposals. Come on, everybody in this room knows campaign proposals are half-baked. They often come from people who've never worked in the field. They don't deal with a lot of the details about how they're going to administer it. They don't deal with the question about whether they're going to stop people from going abroad. I wrote a column recently that said they haven't dealt with double taxation
exception of the 2007-2008 McCain campaign, right, Gene?
which Doug worked on. But you don't catch the reference.
Well, Gene,
so it's all those details that are really bothersome. I think actually you could think about using wealth as, if we could measure it correctly, as an indirect way to go at some of the questions about minimum taxes, minimum income taxes. So if we could, for at least that portion of wealth we could measure, we could say, wait a second, you're not reporting any return on that wealth. Let's get at it. Or we could talk about ways of increasing the requirement to use dividends rather than stock buybacks as a way to make sure that some of those returns got taxed. So I think there are ways you can look at wealth and try to increase the taxes on the wealthy. But I think the current design of the current proposals don't make a lot of sense, including Doug's comment about really, if it's going to be confiscatory, it's going to tax more than 100% of your return. That's going to have a lot of behavioral effects that we wouldn't like.
Well, that's
Can I say briefly just two things in rebuttal?
Really
I'm not going to
briefly.
go on too long. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of calls that have to be made. That's why I actually outsourced it. I didn't want to be responsible for all those calls. It's built off consensus estimates in the literature. And there's a bunch of sensitivity analyses in the paper. People can look at it. And that's all it. On this point, how you use the money matters enormously. And one of the things we do is we show the difference in the overall impacts when you do the transfers versus when you invest in a highly productive government activity, whether it's infrastructure or early childhood education, take your pick. And that matters a lot. My takeaway from that is that doesn't tell you anything about wealth taxes. That says if you've got those big productive investments that you can make them and finance them in a less destructive fashion. But go do them. I think that's the right lesson.
I want to move on and ask about the larger tax system beyond taxing wealth. Are there other ways that the broader U.S. tax system could be used to address issues of wealth inequality? We were kind of getting at that.
So we mentioned ways of going after realized gains at death. The last panel actually got into a lot. In fact, it was interesting, the last panel also had to immediately jump into other proposals to get at wealth inequality that went beyond wealth taxes. But I'll go to two specifically in the tax system also, which are the main ways that middle-class people save. And I would say that if I looked at 80% of people in this audience, most of your saving is either in retirement accounts or housing or both. I would guess that I'm probably very accurate in terms of that projection. The one other exception might be small business, but most people don't have small businesses. The tax system has a lot to do with retirement policy and housing policy. And beyond the issues that Kololo raised earlier, both of those policies basically don't benefit low and middle income people much at all. And the home mortgage interest deduction, which now, by the way, only goes to maybe about 10% of the population, which are higher income, does nothing to help people in the middle and at the bottom. On top of that, it actually indirectly subsidizes taking equity out of your home. So it actually is subsidizing consumption and dis-saving. So you could do a lot on housing and retirement policy. I'm not going to go into all the details. Both of those are tax policies that are not oriented towards increasing wealth throughout the middle and the bottom of the wealth and the income distribution.
Actually want to go down the line on this one.
Oh, so I think the most important thing is to recognize that you are going to have a broad array of policy instruments to be successful at this. You can't do it with just the tax code. But there should be a piece that the tax code is responsible for. And the one that I prefer, as I said at the outset, is one where you eventually get every dollar. Right? You either get it during life when it's consumed, or if you try to save it all and pass it on, you have an intergenerational tax that's an effective tax that meets some sort of metric of social justice. And I don't like the one we have now, so I want to have a different one. And I think one of the advantages of running the system the way I'd prefer is if you tax everything that comes out, you're taxing what look like interest, dividends, capital gains, wages, all at the same rate. Whatever your appropriate tax rate is, we tax it. And you get rid of all the financial planning, you get rid of the turning of wage income into disguised capital income and vice versa that we have in the current system. So no one should defend the current system. And we ought to think hard about what we want a better system to accomplish.
So, I mean, I think sort of, again, the big boring picture is that the current federal tax code and the US tax code as a whole does much less than other advanced economies to push back against market income inequality mostly because it is too small. In terms of a share of GDP, again, those historically low levels. And it can be made bigger and more progressive in ways that shrink racial and income and wealth gaps between the top and the bottom of the income distribution, sort of mechanically. And if you're compressing the income distribution and putting some of those revenues into investments that enhance mobility, not only are you making it sort of a shorter distance to travel in terms of intergenerational mobility, but you're also providing those rungs up and down the ladder. In terms of sort of the very first rung of the ladder, but that 50% of households that don't have net assets at the moment, again, we need to pay attention to all those rungs of the ladder, but many of those sort of transfer payments and basic economic security supports that help prevent people from getting into debt cycles, that having to access expensive debt, and affording the basics. There's just a wealth of research showing, and I think Jean was alluding to this, that those sorts of investments have really remarkable long-term impacts on the trajectory of particularly children that grow up in those families, in terms of their health, in terms of their educational outcomes, in terms of their lifetime earnings, in fact. So I think, again, some of all of the above, but a lot of people, about half of people are on that very first rung of the ladder where there are no net assets. And I think, that's a really important place to pay policy attention.
Can I add a footnote just on this international comparison? When I looked at the difference in tax systems between the US and most European countries, the main difference was the value-added tax. Most European countries have almost exactly the same issues in terms of taxing the wealthy people and the returns from capital. They have a much larger taxation on consumption, and that is what largely finances their additional levels of transfers. But it's not that they've done a great job at taxing the wealthy or returns from wealth as well.
I think to one of Jason's first slides, though, there is potentially much more room and much more pressing need to sort of address the top end in the US relative to other countries, given the somewhat extreme levels of inequality and potential non-taxation of some of that accumulated return that's fed into that distribution.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that
both and, yeah.
They have many of the same problems.
So we've been talking a lot about how sort of current tax policy promotes accumulation of wealth at the very top, but I wonder, does it also sort of disincentivize wealth accumulation among the non-wealthy, our current tax policy?
I mean, let's recognize that the tax that matters for most of people who aren't affluent is the payroll tax. The income tax is increasingly a surtax on high-income Americans, and ought to be thought about that way and designed to effectively address that population sort of as a policy matter. So we can jiggle the income tax all we want. We're not going to affect the people at the very bottom who have no assets. That's not where that's going to happen. That's where you have to go to the other side of the ledger and think about the fact that Jean is exactly right in this. We have squeezed out of the budget, and we will increasingly drive it to zero the places where the federal government invests in the future: basic research, infrastructure, education, all of that stuff, which the founders thought was the role of government, is going away. There's no money for it. And that's where you need to go to be effective in providing some opportunities for mobility, giving some human capital. I mean, if you look at the education system in the United States, it's a freaking disaster. We have a quarter to a third of 4th and 8th graders who are seriously deficient in math and reading, and it's been that way for a decade. We have condemned them to a future economic life that's substandard. That's terrible. You don't solve that with the tax system. You got to get serious about education.
So when I think of the people in the middle and the bottom, I look at the combined, it's both taxes and transfers, but not just separately, but together. The combined incentive effect of those systems actually does discourage wealth holding. It's not, as I said, it's not that middle or low income people get taxed much on the returns from their wealth either, but they don't have that much wealth. But I mean, this will be again controversial, but if you take Social Security policy, for instance, people now retire for 13 more years than they did in 1940 when the system was first created. And the major social policy of the United States, since in the last 80 years, the major social policy of the United States has been, I'm talking about the tax and transfer system, has been to increase the number of years of retirement that people get. And so that people like myself or Doug, maybe at some point later, which I think is a little older, are basically offered several $100,000 literally more in transfers in Social Security because of those many additional years. 13 years is the additional years, 6 or 7 is the additional years we get of benefits. That's huge. And it encourages us often to retire earlier. If I retire that many years earlier, whether it's the 6 or 7 additional years of life or the 13, because now we can retire earlier and the benefits keep going up, basically that's reducing saving. that's reducing wages. That's causing some of the inequality you see in before tax, before transfer income, in wages and the financial and real assets that people hold. So we really need to think about this systematically and holistically when we want to get public. And I think all of us actually agreed. All of us really want to put more money into those things that are along the lines of human capital formation and promote financial and real capital ownership by people. But I think it's the tax and the transfer system together.
And for two reasons, both because you could take the revenue and put it in those more productive and supportive investments, and because they are contributing to sort of the wrong direction. There are a lot of parts of the tax code at the moment that are explicitly, supposedly about building human capital and savings and housing capital, the deductions and exemptions that we talked about before, that are just very tilted towards people that are doing all of those things anyway. And not doing anything for those people with that sort of 50% of the population with no assets and no liquidity to put towards the savings or assets that allow them to get those tax breaks in the first place. So that's a really key area to look at as well.
Chai-Ching, I wanted to ask you, because you have brought up racial equity several times. I know you've done research on how current tax policy kind of contributes to this racial wealth gap that we've been talking about all morning. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your research has found?
So, I mean, I think, again, starting with the perspective that this frame encourages us to look at systematically all of the things that feed in. And you can look at basically every aspect of the tax code and take a look at it from that perspective. But there are three broad sort of buckets that I put them into. The first is the sort of overall revenue generation and progressivity that we talked about previously. And that's a really first order question that we need to be sort of doing more to push back against market inequality and raise revenues to put towards opportunity increasing investments, and particularly those that address or redress some of the public policies that have erected those barriers in the first place. The second is sort of looking at those specific aspects of the tax code that either, unfortunately, more often than not, contribute to inequity. Some of those deductions and exemptions that I talked about, not only are they tilted towards high-income people, but they therefore exacerbate racial wealth and income gaps because those higher income people tend to be disproportionately whiter. And in addition to that, they layer on top of structural systems that mean that even if you were to have a Black or a Latino household that had the same income and the same wealth as a white household, even in that situation, if they were to both purchase a house, for example, and try to claim the mortgage interest deduction, the white household is more likely to be able to invest in a more favourable housing market, get better credit, and Kololo and other people's research have shown over time accumulate more gain from that initial tax break. So that's another bucket. There are some aspects that push against that. The tax credits, EITC, child tax credit, are really important, both because they disproportionately reach households at the bottom and because of the lifetime impacts on children in those households. And then the third sort of broad bucket is tax administration, both under enforcement of taxes that are owed at the top, disproportionately wealthy white people, and sometimes inability to access tax credits and tax breaks by households of colour and other households at the bottom.
Can I add two footnotes to that too? So in addition to the 9 charts on wealth inequality that Kololo laid out, we've tried to examine a lot of these issues too. And some of them sort of fall under the radar screen. So for instance, the fact that wealth inequality is growing by age actually has a racial dimension because people of color are increasingly in the younger population and whites are increasingly in the older population. So when you have this distortion getting worse in terms of favoring policies, say for the favor existing wealth holders or the old in terms of transfer policy as well, that actually adds to a racial wealth gap in ways that people often don't think about. And another example happens to be just the way this gets into, I like your bucket analogy. There's just a lot of buckets. But when I look at housing regulation policy, which we haven't even gotten to, housing regulation right before the Great Recession basically said, we're going to try to really encourage everybody to own housing no matter how much wealth, asset value is increasing. And then after the Great Recession, they said, boy, we're really going to push against it. Well, who got hurt the worst? It was actually the young people, which again, and often predominantly people of color, disproportionately, because people like myself who owned housing from the late 90s to 2006 had huge gains that were more greater than the losses we got in the Great Recession, and then we got the gains afterwards. So we actually had a buy high, sell low type of policy that mainly affected people who were younger and disproportionately people of color. So there are things like that that are just not well thought out when we deal with all our policies. I know this topic today is not in regulatory policy, but there are a lot of ways that we really need to examine all these buckets that Cha-Ching so well lays out.
I want to ask about the parts of our tax policy that are meant to benefit lower income people, like the EITC. How well are those working, and how could they be added to or changed to better work for people who don't have a lot of wealth?
So the EITC is our best performing poverty program, and it's an enormous success, and it could and should be beefed up, particularly for single non-custodial parents, where it's just way too thin. But there are a lot of lessons to be learned about a policy that encourages work, is targeted at the low end, and really has been proven to be very, very effective.
Yeah, I think it's both and. I mean, the existing earned income tax credit and child tax credit, these are refundable credits that are available to low and moderate income households. And they both disproportionately reach households of color because our current income and wealth distribution is such that low and moderate income households are disproportionately households of color because of all of the systemic factors that we talked about before. But also, those who are currently left out at the very bottom because of the way that they have been designed over time are also disproportionately households of color. So some really important proposals to strengthen the credits, including to include a more robust earned income tax credit for those so-called childless adults, many of whom may be non-custodial parents, many of whom may be future parents, many of whom are helping to care for a child in the broader household. That's a really important thing and has actually come out of research from a concern around young minority men entering the labour force. And in addition, making the child tax credit more available to people with households with low earnings, including proposals to make it fully refundable, would also disproportionately help and reach those households of colour who are currently left out by the current structure that doesn't allow you to start earning a child tax credit until you have earnings of $2,500. So those are really important pieces of the puzzle. Again, not only because of mechanically they're helping people with their immediate resources, but the research is showing that giving those people the immediate resources and the ability to put those resources to what is most important for their families is having really big long-term effects across a whole range of outcomes.
So all of us in this up here right now are fans of the earned income tax credit, and some of these. It's not that it doesn't have problems, but relative to other approaches, it seems to be a lot better, which is one way that we should be measuring its success, not just by itself what it does, but how it works relative to other alternatives. But if you look at the history, and I may be misquoting Janet Holtzblatt, who did most of the work organizing this session here, is the biggest increase in the ITC came in 1990 under George H.W. Bush. Republicans have run from it ever since because they don't want to claim credit. The second biggest, I believe, was under Ronald Reagan in '86, and the third biggest was in '93 under Bill Clinton, who wanted to claim not only all the success that he did in '93, but some of the phase-in for George H.W. Bush before then. Since then, there's been very little and modest increases in the earned income tax credit. So it's another example of how, relatively speaking, we're not actually moving in the direction of promoting capital formation, human capital formation in this case.
I think we have time for one more question, so I want to ask more of a philosophical question. When we talk about the wealth tax and we debate it, does it play into the politics of envy? And if so, what are the consequences of that and our ability to have like a productive conversation about wealth inequality?
So I've written about this some, but my gigantic concern about the politics of envy is that it, along with attacks on immigrants and other people, is once we decide that the problems in our society are reduced to a small subset of the population, that has great political appeal, right? If you're really a politician, you only want to attack maybe 5 or 10% of the public. So you can say to the other 90%, you know, all the problems we have in society is due to that 5 or 10%. And therefore you, the remaining 90%, don't have any responsibility for fixing things. In the United States, the middle class, and that's defined broadly as almost 80 or 90% of the population, pays for most of government and gets most of government services. We have to be brought into the equation. And it's been a long time since we've had someone like John Kennedy say we're willing to pay any price, bear any burden to be able to make something better. In this case, he was arguing for freedom. But ultimately, we need to have an appeal to all of us. We're all partly responsible. That's actually related, again, to Cololo's notion on structural racism. We're all partly responsible for making the system better. And when we just concentrate on looking at the wealthy and say, aha, we're going to solve all our problems. In fact, all the things we need to increase transfer policy is basically we're going to tax the wealthy. That's not how government grew over the most post-war era. The main way government grew in the post-war era was the Social Security tax, and in Europe, the value-added tax. It wasn't taxes on the wealthy. Not that we shouldn't tax them more. So we have to ask everyone to participate in making the world better. And I think that not only has economic implications for getting the money you need to do things you want to do, but I think it has huge political implications for how well we work together as a society to make things progress.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I just want to add one tiny point to that, which is, you know, this business of singling out them and saying somehow the wealthy are different and we're going to just go, you know, blame them for our problems and tax them, makes two big mistakes. One, it suggests that somehow they're economically isolated from us and we can do anything we want to them. And that's just not true. It's an interconnected economy and no man is an economic island. There will be ramifications of doing that. And the second is the wealthy who are in the 1% all the time, we know them by name. Bill Gates, Bezos, those guys. The really interesting thing is a lot of people bounce up into the top 5%, the top 1%, one time. Right? They get in there 1 year, they come out, they sold their business and retired, and it's a mistake to think that it's a small group of people who aren't us. It's actually us, sometimes migrating in and out of that upper end of the wealth distribution, and to somehow pretend that they're different and tax them differently is a mistake.
I'm going to use my prerogative being on the tax geek panel to somewhat dodge the question and go to a tax geeky point, which is that even if we were to take the frame of everybody needing to contribute, that is the key problem that I see with the current tax code, which is that so much of the income from wealth is not contributing. It's being taxed at a rate of 0, and it's being taxed at a rate of 0 sometimes across generations. And that is a really, I think, important perspective to keep in mind. And I won't give any framing advice around it, but certainly from a policy perspective, that is one of the things I'm focused on.
All right, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. Just wait for a mic to come to you. Gentleman back there.
Hey, Rick Newman, Yahoo Finance. Doug, I'd be interested to hear more about your inheritance tax idea. What would be the purpose? What problem would it solve? And I'd be interested to hear the panelists' ideas about that as well, the other panelists.
Well, I think there are, you know, there's this issue that you know, we just talked about, which is some of this stuff gets missed during people's lifetime and then during intergenerational transfers. That's absolutely true. The estate tax is one of the leakiest things you could design. It's a mess. So you want to have some sort of tax that addresses the part of the income that gets transferred across generations. What's the right way to think about that? For me, it seems to me that what we want is for people to have a more fair jumping off point, that it's not fair for some people to be handed enough money to live in their entire life and not work, and other people to not have that kind of start. We can do some of the starting point by these programs we talked about for human capital building and mobility, the federal government programs. But for the intergenerational part of the affluent, I think it makes more sense to tax you on the basis of how much you inherit. If you're given $5, that's not a lot of money, fine, even if it came from a very affluent person. If you're given $5 million, that's different. And we can decide how much we want to tax that transfer from both the collecting all the potential revenue and giving people fairer starts.
Question? The gentlelady back there.
Kim Rubin, Tax Policy Center. Thank you for this session. I want to ask Doug a specific question and then a broader question that goes back to some of the other panels. Right, so partly what was interesting, if you have something like an inheritance tax, would you do something like tax the basis? Like, would you have some sort of tax and not have step up a basis before you start doing that on the estate? And then also to sort of bring this back to some of the earlier panels we had, there was a fair amount of agreement across all three of you about the fact that maybe what we need to do is focus on the spending side and some of the policies that can help the people at the bottom. What was sort of compelling to me from the last session was the fact that the very wealthy or highest income have political power, and they don't want that to be the case. And so partly, and especially Doug, I'd love you to comment on if part of the way that we could actually have more investment in that lower part and that spending part means that we have to somehow reduce the influence of the very top. How do we do that if we don't have some sort of wealth tax or some way of lowering that influence? Like, how do we get those policies actually passed if politicians mainly answer to the people at the very top?
So the second question is really hard, so I'm going to evade it. The first question is pretty straightforward. If you think about my preferred approach to the tax policy question in general, it is the traditional IRA. So you take the deduction up front, and then when it comes out, including the basis, it is all taxed. I think of the inheritance as basically consumption by the parents in making their kids happy. You want to tax it the same way and get the basis. How you deal with, how you measure, how you address differential political power is really hard. I have no question about that. I am less convinced that it's pure money than a lot of people, because if it was pure money, Mitt Romney would be president, and he's not. So there are power structures that are in place that are about more than just the money, and why we want to leave in place a system where we entitle the old and not the young, and we don't invest in discretionary accounts in the young is just a big problem for me, and I don't know exactly how to solve it.
Gentleman back there, glasses.
If you could address the effect of state and local tax and investment policies on what you're talking about?
So in my view, most transfers have to take place at the federal level. It's one thing to say that people can leave the country to avoid taxes, but it's pretty easy to jump across state lines. I lived right on one side of the Ohio River. I could have moved 2 miles and gone to Indiana from Kentucky. And I think it's hard for states to do a lot on the tax side vis-a-vis the transfer side. Not that they can't do some, but I think there are great limits. However, it's interesting, in the old estate tax framework, we did have this estate tax credit for states that said, hey, if you provide this minimum level of tax, it's not going to cost your individuals in your state anything, and you get to share in some of those collections. And I think we could do something like that with, and by the way, I too favor inheritance tax. We could do that within any tax at death to try to increase the taxes they would collect from wealthy people. But I think to a large extent, a lot of this has to be organized at the federal level. I'm not saying we can't do some at the state level. And Chai Ching's organization, she might want to jump in here, because I know they work a lot on trying to improve progressivity at the state level. But I just think there are just a lot of limits there that you don't face with federal taxation.
I mean, I think the baseline fact on the states is that overall state tax codes are regressive, so they are increasing income and wealth and racial income gaps, and that is a really key area to sort of reverse. And put in a plug for my colleague's great paper on how state tax codes can be better harnessed to do all of those things. But it also sort of puts in context what we need to be doing on the federal level if just part of the progressivity that we have at the federal level is offsetting the regressivity at the state level. So that's another important context point. And then the third is, I think, like these administration issues, when we do get into the sort of like the pros and cons of different ideas, including the interaction with states, are really important. The ability for states to sort of hook up and make decisions based on what the federal tax code does, and particularly tax administration, is really powerful. And at the moment, we've gone in completely the wrong direction. The fact that federal tax administration is underfunded, squeezed, under-enforced is having impacts on states' ability to do what they can at the state level, because there's only so much infrastructure that states can sort of build to fill the gaps of federal administration and enforcement, and we just need to do a lot better with the IRS funding situation.
We'll go here.
Nick Tiedemann from Virginia Tech. I'd like to build on the exchange at the end between someone in this corner and Jason in the last panel. The question is, how do we get more of the taxes of a rent sort and avoid the kind of substitution effects that Doug was talking about? And it seems to me that the interesting thing to think about is to have a wealth tax with a deduction for the depreciated value of investment. What do you think of that?
I'm sorry, are you talking about expensing?
No, expensing is relevant for an income tax. For a wealth tax, you would want to talk about deducting investment so that what you got was a tax on land and the rent from unregulated natural monopolies.
I think, well, I just think that gets awfully complicated. So it sounds like Doug's.
Again, one of the reasons I like this tax base that I have is it exempts from tax the expected rate of return. Any source of return above that gets fully taxed. And so it will get the rents, it'll get monopoly power, it'll get windfall luck, it'll get all of that.
I think one thing we haven't discussed here, partly because I don't think any of us consider ourselves major experts, is what we can do with regulatory policy, by the way. So I think there is a desperate need for a new type of antitrust policy. The monopolies, the rents that people collect today are not the same as they were in the past. And a lot of the very wealthy people are all there because of rents, maybe not initially when they eventually did their inventions and entrepreneurial efforts, but along the way they've been able to capitalize on it and borrow, drive out other firms, so on and so forth. I think we really need to do a lot on that front to get at the rents. I mean, that's probably the main direction I would go.
I also think there's a lot of sort of empirical uncertainty here. I mean, I think my interpretation of the research is that all of these lower rates and preferences on capital income generally, capital accumulation is not particularly sensitive to that. I'm not sure how much better you would do if you were just isolating the normal return. And I think there is some interesting research that suggests that particularly at the corporate level, you might not do that much better, because Lily Batchelder has a really interesting paper that suggests that particularly large public corporations care more about their accounting profits than they do about actually maximizing their normal returns, and that blunts the impact of moving to a system that sort of does isolate that. Having said that, there may be a bunch of revenue raising ability there, and so it makes sense to keep in mind. Another thing we don't really know, although the research has gotten better, is how much supernormal return is actually up there, and that is also something that's...
Well, that's actually sort of the point, which is we don't, and so I would not favor any system where you actually have to take the return and take it apart. I'm going to tax everything. I have no idea what fractions supernormal, what fractions normal. The individual gets to decide that when they make their decisions. That's up to them. So anything that requires the taxing authority to say that's supernormal and that's normal, man, that will run a train through that gap.
No, right. I'm thinking sort of more sort of like minimum rate, sort of a minimum imputed rate of return, or some risk-free return method or something like that, which is sort of trying to get at an economy-wide normal rate.
Okay, the lady there in the yellow scarf.
Hi, Thornton Matheson, TPC. My question kind of plays off Kim's earlier question. There seems to be some level of agreement that there needs to be greater investment in human capital and physical capital from the federal government. One way to fund that, as has been proposed by Warren and Sanders, for example, is to pile on more progressive taxes. But going back to Jean's comment about the typical structure of the national tax system in OECD countries, the excess of spending in most OECD countries over the US level, which is relatively low, is in fact financed by more regressive taxes, by VAT and by excises. So my question then is, what is that a legitimate approach? Can the lower income be made better off by more regressive consumption and excise type taxes? Would that be, given the political constraints of taxing wealthy people for benefits, to fund benefits that they don't themselves receive, is that a more viable approach to the issue?
Right. So there's a great confusion in most publics, not with you, Thornton, but most people in the public really get confused when we talk about progressivity. Because when we talk about progressivity in the tax system, we deal with a sort of proportional basis. Like if the wealthy pay a lower rate of tax than the non-wealthy in some tax system, we call that regressive. When people think about spending policy, say subsidizing Pell Grants, we usually define progressivity not in a proportional basis. We wouldn't say, well, someone with 100,000, if we got a 10% rate of subsidy and someone making 100,000 of income, we gave them 10,000, somebody making 10,000, we gave them 1,000. We say that's horribly regressive, but that's not the same standard. That's an absolute standard. And what that means, what I'm getting to, is anytime a regressive tax adds to government coffers, it almost always leads to greater redistribution, because almost all transfer policies generally don't give more to the rich than they give to the poor. There's exceptions. Social Security is an exception, by the way, but for the most part, the regressive tax often can support, if it's increasing the level of government, as in European countries, can lead to a more progressive system overall because it redistributes. And the confusion, as I say, gets in this definition of progressivity. When you think about spending versus taxes, you get an inconsistent definition between the two.
I think it's a question of prioritization. I mean, I think, it feels very difficult to say that that's maybe a cab that you want to take at some point, but when you are faced with a lot of capital income that is facing absolutely zero, there seems to be a fairly strong case for a sort of a prioritization of there first. That would be sort of, I think it's a priorities question as opposed to sort of ultimately what you want to be. But certainly in terms of looking at sort of where are we now, 16-ish% of GDP in revenues for the next couple of years versus most developed economies well over 20, there are a lot of things that can be in the mix for getting from here to there.
Eric Toda, Tax Policy Center. When TPC analyzed the recent tax bill and found it disproportionately reduced taxes at the top of distribution, that was a result of mainly two provisions: the reduction in the corporate tax rate to 21% and the 20% deduction for pass-through businesses. So I'm going to make this question as broad as possible. What role can reform of taxation of corporate and business income have in reducing wealth inequality?
Thank you so much for asking that question and prompting that we shouldn't forget that this is a huge part of the capital income story, and ultimately those are individuals owning the capital. And I think it's, on the two that you mentioned, effective corporate rates should, go up if you're not doing anything else with the integration or something bigger picture that you've suggested. The pass-through deduction is terrible, bad, no good, horrible, and all the other epithets that I can throw at it. And it is not only regressive and costly, but is creating a massive avoidance and structuring industry that is just counterproductive on so many different fronts. The first panel today actually made me think more about the way in which it interacts with some of the corporate governance issues that were brought up around S corporations, because a lot of those pass-throughs are not in fact small. They're massive in terms of either profits or assets, as much of your research has shown.
So to me, there's two issues in the corporate tax. When I studied the taxation of capital income over 30 years ago, I concluded even then that the corporate tax was the main way we taxed returns from capital. We weren't taxing individuals for the most part for the same reasons I laid out earlier, include that a lot of the income is accrued as capital gains and never taxed. The corporation will always be, or the big business, I might say, will always be the major tax collector in this country. I don't care what the tax is, whether it's a Social Security tax, a tax on individual, or anything else. So I think corporate taxation, thought of broadly as collecting taxes on owners of capital, will have to play a major role. Now, maybe it's that they've got to do it through something that might keep the individual rate low enough. If the corporate rate is high enough, it might have to do with some forms of integration. If you want to tax capital income at some level, it seems to be the corporation always has to be a major player. And it's going to be very hard, both administratively, but also politically, to only do it at the individual level. And it's also hard politically to do things, as much as I'm in favor of inheritance taxes and taxes like that, the notion of having a lump sum tax all at one point in time, rather than as income is earned, is very, very, very hard to sell to the public, even the public that doesn't pay those taxes. It just looks bad. They'll go along more with income being taxed as it's earned than waiting till down the road to try to collect it.
That's a really good question. So it's useful to remember how we got here, right? So a complete consensus that the U.S. corporation income tax was out of line with international norms. The rate was too high. The base was worldwide, more worldwide than others, and had to be more territorial. And so that drove the rate down to get it back into the middle of the pack, not even low by international standards. And the Europeans had done this already, right? Their solution to the problem was to have value-added taxes pick up the remainder of the revenue burden. And so they actually have these very efficient corporate systems. We have this relatively bizarre, from a tax perspective, system where the vast majority of business income is taxed on individual returns as these pass-through entities. So if you do something to the corporates, you have to do something over on the individual side to try to get the effective rate of tax on capital the same across the two platforms. And the deduction doesn't come close to doing that and can't be defended on that grounds, but it does tell you where I think we ought to go. Number one, we ought to have an integrated business tax and take that stuff off the individual return as pass-throughs and whatever you want to call it, and tax businesses, because they will be the major collector and remitter of taxes going forward. So let's just put all business entities in the same system and have that system make sense, right? There was a lot of the reforms that I 100% favor, but it doesn't make any sense to have expensing of capital investment and deductibility of interest. Like, I'm all for driving the effective rate of tax on the normal rate of return to zero, but negative is a bit much. And that's what we have right now. That's crazy. So we could do a lot about collecting more revenue without dealing with the rate. Get the base right. We haven't touched the base near enough in that reform.
Okay, I think we are out of time. So on behalf of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, I want to thank our panel and all our speakers today, and also you, the audience, for coming out. Thank you.
Well done as usual.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.